Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where ancient chaos becomes a bedtime story, and even gods learn to yawn. Tonight, we're wandering through the entire tapestry of Greek mythology, from the quiet beginning before time to the rise of Olympus, through the age of heroes, wars and fates, and finally to the soft echo these stories still leave in us. It's a long journey, but a calm one. A stroll through eternity rather than a race through it. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy drifting into the past while listening to the gentle sound of civilization making mistakes. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to know how many of us are awake at the wrong hour together, travelling through myth instead of dreams. Now, dim the lights. Maybe let the quiet hum of a fan or a soft lamp flicker near you. There's no rush here. The gods waited for eons to be born. We can take a slow breath before meeting them. If your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift like a cloud crossing an ancient sky. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story, one calm thought at a time. And so, let us begin, not with a bang, not with a light, but with the simplest, oldest thing of all, silence. Before there was earth or sky, before even the idea of before, there was something the Greeks called chaos. Not chaos in the way we use it now, not disorder, not noise. It was the opposite, a wide, silent gap. The empty space between what could exist and what had not yet dared to. You could think of it as a pause that lasted forever, the breath the universe took before saying its first word. From that space things began to appear, not as explosions, but as quiet ideas trying to remember their shape. The first to wake was Gaia, the earth, vast and heavy and patient. Then Tartarus, the deep place below all things, not a hell, just a hollow, the echo that gives sound meaning. From the night itself came Nyx, cloaked and silent, followed by her shadow, Erebus, who lived in the folds of darkness. And from their meeting came Ether and Hemera, light and day, forever chasing each other around the edges of the world, one never quite catching the other. The Greeks imagined it not as a battle, but as a rhythm, night falling into day, day dissolving into night. The same way we drift between sleep and waking. In their story, the world didn't begin because someone decided it should. It began because emptiness got lonely. Then, from the mingling of these first beings, Eros appeared, love, or maybe attraction, the pull that draws things toward one another. The poet said he was the oldest of all gods, because nothing could form or stay together without him. You could say that Eros was the reason stars gather in galaxies, or why your hand reaches out to touch another. In that ancient sense, love wasn't romantic. It was the universe learning to hold itself together. Gaia looked around and saw her own vastness, a lonely stretch of green and stone. From herself, she brought forth Uranos, the sky, to cover her and keep her company. He was broad, blue and brilliant, but heavy in presence. Together they formed the first pair, earth and sky, the endless embrace that built the horizon. From their union came 12 mighty beings, the Titans. Among them were Oceanus, who circled the world like a ring of water, Hyperion, who gave light, Themis, who spoke of justice, and Cronus, who learned to wait. But not all their children were graceful. Gaia also birthed the Cyclopes, giant beings with a single blazing eye, and the 100-handed ones, massive and strange. Uranos found them unsettling, as many parents do when confronted with their own creations. Out of fear, he hid them deep within Gaia's body, locking them inside the earth, and Gaia, suffocating with her children trapped within her, began to ache. The Greeks described this pain not with science, but with sympathy. The first rebellion in existence was not about power, it was about breathing again. So Gaia called upon her son Cronus, the titan of time and patience, and whispered to him that even the heavens can be cut down to size. She fashioned a sickle from the hardest flint, sharp and cold, and Cronus took it with trembling hands. When night came and Uranus leaned down to blanket Gaia once more, Cronus rose. The sickle flashed, a single arc of defiance across the newborn sky. Uranus fell, and from his spilled essence came strange and lasting things. The Furies, spirits of vengeance, the giants, children of anger, and Aphrodite, foam-born from the sea, the softest thing born of the harshest act. It was not a pleasant story, but it was an honest one. Creation for the Greeks was never gentle. Every birth was also a wound. The cosmos wasn't built by choice, but by consequence. Even the gods began with regret, and so Cronus took the throne. Under his rule came what later poets would call the Golden Age, an age without war, without toil, without greed. Humanity lived as children of the earth, untroubled and unmeasured by time. But in every stillness hides a shadow. Cronus, like his father, heard a prophecy that one day he too would be overthrown by his own son, and in fear he began to do what his father had done. He swallowed his children one by one, mistaking consumption for control. Gaia, watching another generation repeat the same mistake, sighed deeply. The pattern of heaven and earth, love and fear was already forming. It would repeat itself again and again, from gods to heroes to humans. The Greeks understood that well. That order is only the memory of chaos, briefly holding its breath. Somewhere, in the hidden cave of Crete, a child was crying. The sound was faint, muffled under the bleating of goats and the hum of unseen wings. The sky above still shivered from its first wound. The earth below was warm with new blood. But in between, in that trembling silence, something extraordinary had happened. Nothing had learned to breathe. Time, as the Greeks told it, began not with minutes or hours, but with waiting. The Titans ruled under Cronus's calm and heavy silence. The world was wide and unmeasured, the air clear, the sea unmoving. It was an age without hunger or age or ambition. The people, if they could be called that, lived as contented shadows, grazing on what the earth offered, like children too young to imagine danger. But even paradise, left too long untouched, begins to feel stale. The sky was fixed, the rivers too calm, the wind too polite. Nothing dared to move until something inside the world started to itch again. Cronus sat on his mountain throne, thoughtful, distant, a god who counted only his fears. He had swallowed all but one of his children, each time convincing himself it was for their safety, or his. He was not cruel, only terrified of what the future might hold. That was the Greek idea of power, not joy but constant vigilance. To rule the world was to wake every morning certain that someone, somewhere, was planning to end you. Rhea, his wife, grew tired of this silent cruelty. One by one, she had handed over her newborns and listened to the same wet sound as Cronus devoured them. When she carried her sixth child, she could not bear to repeat the cycle. Guided by Gaia, who remembered too well what it felt like to be a mother and a prisoner, Rhea tricked her husband. She gave birth in secret on the island of Crete and hid the infant in a cave. In place of the baby, she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and offered it to Cronus. He swallowed it without looking, proof that even a god can mistake weight for worth. The child in the cave was named Zeus. He was nursed by a divine goat and lulled to sleep by the clashing of shields. The Curetes, young warriors who danced and beat their weapons so that his cries would be hidden from his father's ears. The Greeks liked this image, the future of the cosmos guarded by noise, the sound of chaos returning to protect creation. Years passed. Zeus grew tall, clever, and restless. He saw the stillness of the Golden Age and found it unnatural, like air that refused to move. He visited Gaia, the earth herself, who told him that life, once born, must change. Even the stars, she said, must shift their places eventually. The Greeks imagined the earth as old and wise, not gentle but pragmatic. A mother who loved her children enough to let them fight. Zeus went to seek allies. In the depths of Tartarus, he found the Cyclopes and the 100-handers still imprisoned, just as his grandfather Uranus had left them. They were monstrous, yes, but innocent in their strength. Zeus broke their chains, and in gratitude they offered him gifts. From the Cyclopes, the thunderbolt, a bright memory of fire, for Poseidon the trident, a spear of sea and storm, and for Hades, a helmet woven from night, making the wearer invisible. These gifts weren't weapons so much as symbols: power, dominion, and the right to vanish when necessary. The Greeks didn't separate war from politics. To have a thunderbolt was to have authority. To hold a trident was to make the sea obey. To wear the helm of darkness was to command silence itself. Then came the Titanomachy, the war of gods and titans, sky and earth, youth and age. The poet said it lasted 10 years, though the years had not yet been invented. The world was the battlefield. Mountains were hurled, seas boiled, the air tore apart with flame. The 100-handers fought with such fury that even the stars trembled. Cronus's proud empire cracked under the weight of its own eternity. It was not simply a rebellion, it was evolution. The old order refusing to admit that the world had outgrown it. The Greeks never saw these wars as moral tales. They were cycles, inevitable as seasons. Every victory carried the seed of another fall. When Zeus finally stood over the defeated Titans, lightning fading in his hands, he did not gloat. He simply built new prisons for the old gods, sending them down to Tartarus, their roars echoing through the dark like thunder that no longer reached the sky. When the dust cleared, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, gathered to decide the shape of their shared rule. They cast lots, because fairness, even among immortals, required a little gambling. Zeus won the sky, Poseidon took the sea, and Hades accepted the underworld. The earth itself was left unclaimed, to be shared among them, a neutral ground where their influence could overlap, though rarely without consequence. Zeus built his palace on Mount Olympus, the tallest peak in Greece, high enough to touch the clouds yet visible to mortals. It was said that on quiet days, when no storms gathered, you could almost see the shimmer of its gates. The air there was sweet and thin, like the breath before laughter. From that height the gods would look down upon the mortal world, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in irritation, but never indifferently. This new world was alive in a way the old one had not been. Rivers ran with purpose, trees reached higher, animals wandered freely, unafraid of the sky. There was a sense, faint but growing, that the universe had learned rhythm. The Greeks loved that idea, that even chaos, if it repeats long enough, becomes music. Still, beneath the order, something restless remained. Cronus, imprisoned in the deep, whispered to his brothers and sisters that time cannot be caged. His voice was faint, but it travelled upward like a slow current of memory. The Greeks believed that this is why thunder sometimes rolls without rain. It is the sound of the old gods remembering they once ruled. Zeus, now king, watched over his siblings with a wary pride. Hera, Demeter, Hestia, Poseidon, and Hades each carried their own power, their own rivalries. The family was vast, magnificent, and doomed to quarrel. But for the first time, the heavens were not empty. They were full of voices. The long silence after creation had ended, replaced by argument, laughter, and jealousy. In short, by life itself. The first revolt had done its job. It had taught the universe to breathe deeply, even when that breath trembled with thunder. And somewhere below, in the quiet heart of the earth, Gaia smiled again. For her children had finally learned what she always knew, that creation and rebellion are the same heartbeat heard from different sides of the world. When the sky had settled and the noise of war finally thinned into silence, the world began to remember how to breathe again. Stones cooled, seas softened, and the first sunlight spilled across the mountains like a cautious apology. The Titans were gone, the old thunder buried deep below the roots of the world. Above them all, Zeus ruled from Olympus, young, radiant and confident that order had finally arrived. But before his reign, there had been another age, the time of Cronus, when everything had been still and simple. The poets later called it the Golden Age, and they described it as though the world had been half asleep, dreaming, a pleasant dream of peace. In those days, humans lived close to the earth itself. They worked a little, slept often, and never grew old. The fields yielded grain without ploughs, rivers ran clear, and the air itself seemed to sing. There was no winter, no need to store or hunt or fight. Hunger and greed had not yet learned each other's names. The people of that era did not pray to the gods, because they had no reason to. They lived like children, innocent, dependent, unaware that innocence never lasts. Cronus ruled not as a tyrant but as a gardener. His power was quiet, patient, cyclical. Seasons moved gently and the stars held their breath. For a time, even Gaia seemed content. Yet in every paradise there waits a small imperfection, a soft crack that widens slowly. For Cronus, that flaw was fear. He had heard the prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, as he had once overthrown his father, and in that single sentence his peace began to unravel. The Greeks understood this fear deeply. To them, power was never a reward, it was a weight. They saw in their gods a reflection of themselves, each victory bringing its own anxiety. Cronus had swallowed his children to stop time from moving forward, but by doing so he had already proven the prophecy right. The moment you try to halt the future, you've already begun to lose to it. Rhea, his wife, moved quietly through this golden stillness, pretending contentment. The people worshipped her as the mother of gods, the eternal nurturer, but inside she was hollowed by grief. One by one, she had handed over her infants, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and watched them disappear into her husband's vast silence. Only Gaia knew the full weight of her sorrow, for she had once felt it too. And so, when Rhea carried her final child, Gaia whispered to her through the soil, "Hide this one. Let him be the breath that breaks your chain." Thus began the first secret in heaven. When the time came, Rhea gave birth in a cave on the island of Crete, surrounded by the rhythmic drumming of the Curite, soldiers who beat their shields to mask the baby's cries. The child, Zeus, was fed with honey and goat's milk, rocked to sleep by mountain winds. Rhea returned to Cronus with a stone wrapped in cloth. He swallowed it without suspicion, the ultimate act of divine complacency. The Greeks always loved this irony. A god so powerful he could devour eternity, yet so foolish he couldn't tell a rock from a child. In the cave, time passed differently. Zeus grew, watched by spirits of nature, dryads, nymphs, and whispering winds. He learned the language of thunder long before he could speak, and somewhere deep inside him, a sense of balance took root. The instinct that every cage has a key, and every silence deserves an answer. When he was grown, Zeus went to seek justice, or perhaps revenge. The two are difficult to separate in mythology. With the help of Gaia, he offered Cronus a potion brewed from the earth's secret herbs. The potion made Cronus wretch, and from his body emerged the 5 swallowed siblings, reborn and shining. The family reunited, though not yet forgiven, prepared to end the long age of stillness. The battle that followed was not a single explosion of violence, but a slow unrolling of change. The Titans fought to preserve their calm perfection. The new gods fought for movement. Lightning cracked, seas rose, mountains were thrown like spears. It was not good versus evil, it was stillness versus growth. The Greeks never saw the gods as moral teachers. They were weather systems of emotion, constantly colliding, each storm leaving the world a little more defined. When Zeus finally triumphed, he didn't destroy his father. He exiled him, not to Tartarus this time, but to a quiet edge of the world, beyond the ocean. Some poets said Cronus slept there, dreaming of the age he had lost. Others whispered he still ruled a small hidden paradise, an aftertaste of perfection kept alive for those who missed the old days. The Greeks couldn't decide whether to mourn or celebrate him. They loved their myths the way we love our memories, even the painful ones. The Golden Age ended quietly, like a song fading out. Mortals began to till the earth, to grow old, to build walls against the wind. Work appeared, so did envy. But they also learned fire, language, and prayer. It was as if the gods had stepped back to see what humans would do with their own hands. And though life became harder, it also became more vivid. The Greeks didn't imagine a fall from grace as later faiths did. They imagined an awakening. Paradise was not lost, it was simply traded for awareness. Still, in the hearts of the people, there remained a longing for the warmth of that vanished peace. They told stories of a time when humans and gods had shared bread, when fruit fell into open hands, when night arrived like a blanket rather than a warning. The memory of that world became a compass for the future, the reason humans kept seeking order, fairness, and beauty. They were not trying to rise above the gods, they were just trying to get back to the moment before fear. And so, Cronus's legacy lived on. Not in his power, but in his regret. His age became the measuring stick for all ages that followed, the impossible dream of balance without consequence. Even now, when people imagine a perfect world, they borrow the name of that lost time. They call it a golden age. They rarely remember the hunger behind it, the quiet, suffocating stillness that made the world beg for change. As the sun set on the last day of his reign, Cronus looked at the horizon, knowing his prophecy had come true. The child he feared had saved him from himself. Above him, thunder gathered softly, not in anger but in recognition. The sky was no longer empty. It was alive, full of the same restless breath that had begun the world. And somewhere in the wind, the faintest whisper of laughter, not cruel, not mocking, just relieved, drifted through the clouds. The age of ease had ended, but the age of meaning had begun. The air was still trembling from the memory of the Titan's fall. The world had been reshaped by fire and grief, and in the faint golden light that followed, everything looked new, as if the earth itself was catching its breath after a storm. Mountains leaned a little closer to the sky, rivers found new courses, and silence settled again. Not the old, suffocating silence of Cronus's age, but one that hummed faintly, alive and uncertain. Zeus stood at the edge of the world, watching the horizon glow. The war was over. The Titans had been chained in Tartarus, their cries echoing through caverns deeper than memory. Time had survived its own rebellion. The new gods, younger and stranger, stood beside him. They were not creatures of stillness. They were motion given form, flame, wave, whisper, fury. The universe for the first time had personality. The Greeks called this the dawn of the Olympian order. It was the moment when chaos, love, and vengeance finally agreed to share the same sky. Zeus gathered his brothers and sisters, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, and they divided the world the way families divide an inheritance, with ceremony, argument, and a little suspicion. They drew lots, for even the gods preferred luck over endless debate. Zeus received the sky and the storm, Poseidon took the sea, and Hades accepted the realm beneath the earth. The land itself remained neutral, the shared home of mortals and fate. In this new balance, the Greeks saw something they recognized: bureaucracy. Every god had a department, a field of influence, a portfolio of miracles and disasters. The heavens were no longer a wild expanse. They had become a divine administration, each sibling responsible for a different element of existence. Zeus oversaw law and thunder. Hera managed marriage and the complicated art of jealousy. Demeter handled agriculture and grief. Poseidon took charge of storms and tempers, and Hades ruled the quiet kingdom of endings. Hestia tended the hearth, a god of stillness in a family of noise. The poets imagined Olympus as a shining court above the clouds, unreachable but always watching. The gods held feasts, debated mortals, and occasionally interfered in their lives for reasons ranging from curiosity to boredom. They weren't perfect, that was the point. The Greeks did not believe in spotless divinity. They preferred their gods to be flawed, impulsive, and vividly human. To them, Olympus was not heaven. It was a mirror, the highest version of humanity, noble and ridiculous in equal measure. Zeus, though young, ruled with the wary wisdom of someone who had seen too many fathers fall. He valued order above peace, because peace never lasted without it. To him, thunder was not just a weapon, it was punctuation, a reminder that silence too long unbroken invites rebellion. When he raised his hand, the sky obeyed. When he slept, the world listened. And when he spoke, even the wind paused, unsure whether to carry his words or hide them. His reign began with construction, not conquest. He summoned the Cyclops once more, asking them to build palaces, forges, and halls across Olympus. Their fires became the stars, their hammers the heartbeat of the sky. From their labour came beauty and danger both. Chariots that could ride the clouds, weapons that could split mountains, and a throne carved from the bones of lightning itself. Hera watched all this with equal parts pride and irritation. She loved Zeus, though love for a god is rarely peaceful. The poets described her as both queen and storm, radiant, wise, and prone to throwing things. She and Zeus would argue for centuries, their quarrels shaping weather patterns and legends alike. The Greeks had no illusions about marriage. Even the divine ones required thunder. While Olympus rose, the earth below began to change. Gaia, the Great Mother, stirred again. She had seen her children imprisoned and her grandchildren claim the heavens, and the old ache of betrayal returned. From the ashes of her sorrow, she bore a new generation. The giants, vast and defiant, born to challenge the new gods. Their rebellion was swift, fierce, and doomed. The Olympians fought together this time, not as rivals, but as kin defending a fragile order. Zeus hurled thunderbolts that lit the sea. Athena raised mountains as shields. Poseidon struck the ground, splitting islands apart. When the dust cleared, the giants lay still, and the sky was quiet again. But peace never arrives without a price. From the last drop of blood spilled upon the earth, new beings rose. The Erinyes, the Furies, spirits of vengeance who would forever punish crimes that broke the natural order. Even the gods feared them, for they served something older than Olympus, the law of consequence. Their wings were black, their voices relentless. They reminded the new rulers that justice was not invention but inheritance. Zeus understood the warning. He had built a kingdom on rebellion. He knew another could rise from it just as easily. So he swore an oath, not of perfection but of restraint. He would rule with strength but allow dissent, command the heavens but never again silence the earth. It was an uneasy truce, the kind of promise that keeps the world balanced between mercy and fear. The Greeks saw beauty in this fragility. To them, the world's harmony wasn't divine grace. It was the product of constant negotiation. The sun rose because someone remembered to pull it up. Rain fell because another god finally forgave a slight. The universe worked not because it was perfect, but because it was endlessly patched together by flawed hands. The last act of this divine settlement was the creation of Olympus itself, the mountain that would become the centre of the cosmos. The poets imagined its peaks shining with eternal snow, its halls made of mist and gold, its air trembling with laughter and thunder. Mortals at the base of the mountain could sometimes hear echoes, the faint hum of arguments, music, and gossip drifting down from the clouds. They prayed upward, unsure if anyone listened, and perhaps that was the quiet joke of Olympus. The gods were watching, but they were also distracted. Still, for a brief and shining age, the universe held its shape. The sky ruled, the sea moved, the earth fed, the underworld waited. Order, at last, had taken a seat beside chaos. The cosmos was no longer a scream, it was a conversation. And yet, as always in Greek myth, order never arrives alone. It brings with it the whisper of disobedience, the hint of story. Somewhere beyond Olympus, a flicker of fire, a jar sealed too tightly, and a pair of curious eyes were already waiting to open the next chapter of trouble. The storm had ended. The mountains, once torn by war, now glittered under a calm blue sky. Far above the clouds, where the air thins and human breath falters, the gods built their new home. The Greeks called it Olympus, a name that sounded both sharp and soft, like a breath cut short by wonder. They imagined its slopes glowing white with snow, though the snow never melted, and its peaks shimmering gold in the sunlight. When lightning struck nearby, mortals said it wasn't a storm at all. It was the gods rearranging furniture. Olympus wasn't heaven in the later sense. It was more like the first divine office building. Marble halls, endless meetings, too many opinions. The air smelled faintly of nectar, a scent somewhere between honey and pride. Music floated through the corridors, but so did the occasional argument. This was no paradise of harmony. It was a celestial workplace full of family members who could never be fired. Zeus presided over it all from a throne carved from storm clouds and precious stone. He ruled with authority born not from love but from survival. He had outlasted his father, his grandfather, and an entire generation of titans. He understood what power cost and what it required to keep. Every bolt of lightning was both a warning and a reminder that even gods needed discipline. Yet his leadership style, if one could call it that, resembled that of a very distracted manager. He held meetings, yes, great councils where the air hummed with divine politics, but he also enjoyed delegation, preferably to someone else. As mortals would later say, he didn't end chaos, he just managed it better. Hera sat beside him, regal and radiant, wearing the crown of a queen who knew every secret of her husband's flaws. She was the goddess of marriage, which made her an expert in disappointment. The poets loved her contradictions, the way she could nurture and destroy, adore and punish. They painted her with eyes wide and calm, but everyone knew those eyes missed nothing. Hera kept Olympus running, sometimes through affection, sometimes through fear. She was the reason meetings started on time. Then there was Demeter, sister to both and keeper of the harvest. Where Hera governed loyalty, Demeter governed sustenance, the quiet promise that bread would rise and fields would bloom. Her moods shaped the seasons, her sorrow could starve the world. She was a goddess who didn't speak loudly, yet when she grieved, the entire earth went cold. Hestia, gentle and reserved, tended the hearth, the eternal flame that burned at the centre of Olympus. She didn't argue or compete, she simply kept the fire alive. To the Greeks, she was the comfort of home, the glow behind every door, the warmth that asked for nothing. If the others were thunder, she was the soft hum that made existence bearable. Then came the younger generation, gods born of story rather than ancestry. Athena, born from Zeus's head fully armed, was the goddess of wisdom and strategy. The Greeks admired her calm precision. She didn't raise her voice, she raised civilizations. When she appeared, she was often accompanied by an owl, symbol of perception, and the faint sound of bronze, as if thought itself had armour. Apollo, god of light, reason and art, shone beside her. He was the poet of the gods, the one who believed truth could be sung into existence. His twin, Artemis, ruled the night with opposite grace, goddess of the moon, wilderness and unbroken silence. Together, they embodied the balance between knowing and mystery. The Greeks found peace in that symmetry. Every beam of sunlight had its echo in moonlight. Ares, the god of war, was less poetic. He loved conflict for its own sake, the noise and heat of it, the rush of strength before consequence. Even the other gods found him exhausting. Hephaestus, by contrast, was the quiet craftsman, lame in one leg, scarred by rejection, but indispensable. He forged the weapons of Olympus, the crowns, the chains, the armour, and sometimes the very sky. He was proof that even heaven needs a mechanic. Aphrodite, born from sea foam and divine embarrassment, walked among them like a living contradiction. She inspired love, beauty, desire and jealousy, often all at once. The Greeks knew she was not kind, but she was necessary. Where she went, hearts beat faster, nations rose and fell, and poets found employment. Hermes darted between them all, messenger, thief, inventor of lies, and patron of travellers. He carried dreams, guided souls, and occasionally swapped divine correspondence for fun. No one trusted him completely, yet everyone relied on him. He was the bridge between worlds, the whisper that connected Olympus to Earth. These were the Olympians, the 12 who sat at the eternal table. To the Greeks, they represented the entire range of human nature. They argued, they schemed, they fell in love, they sulked. They were powerful, but never perfect. In fact, perfection would have ruined them. A flawless god couldn't explain why humanity existed. Flaws, on the other hand, made everything relatable. The poets described their meals as endless feasts of ambrosia, the food of immortality. But immortality, as it turned out, was less about living forever and more about never being able to leave a meeting. The gods debated over mortals, who deserved luck, who deserved punishment, who had prayed properly. Every decision took longer than necessary because even eternity has red tape. Zeus tried to keep peace among them, but peace among immortals is like silence at a festival. Technically possible, rarely observed. Jealousies grew, alliances shifted. The mountain trembled with their emotions. When they quarrelled, storms broke over the Aegean. When they laughed, sunlight poured across the fields. Mortals lived under this weather of divine moods, never sure whether to praise or hide, and yet, despite their chaos, Olympus brought order. The seasons kept their rhythm. The stars held their positions. The world turned under a system that somehow worked because no one dared to stop it. The gods had become administrators of existence, a pantheon that ruled not through harmony, but through routine. One day, as the story goes, Zeus looked down at the earth and saw a curious thing. Among the forests and rivers, the shadows began to move differently. Shapes formed, upright, thoughtful, trembling with wonder. They weren't gods, but they looked suspiciously like them. In their faces he saw fragments of Olympus: pride, love, anger, humour, and the faint glimmer of hope. The gods had built their kingdom in their own image, but in doing so they had accidentally created a mirror. Humanity, fragile and curious, had arrived, and while the gods ruled the sky, these new beings would soon begin ruling meaning, with questions, stories, and dreams that even Zeus couldn't control. The mountain stood silent for a while, as if the heavens themselves were thinking. Somewhere on its peak, the fire in Hestia's hearth flickered, sensing that a new kind of warmth had entered the world, one that burned not from divinity, but from curiosity. The mountain had settled into its rhythm. Lightning meetings, family quarrels, long lunches of ambrosia. Olympus had become a routine. The gods looked down on the world below and saw forests swaying, rivers flowing, animals wandering. It was beautiful, but it was quiet. There was movement, but no meaning. Zeus watched for a while, perhaps proud of his creation, perhaps a little bored. That was when Prometheus decided to interfere, or, depending on who you asked, to improve things. Prometheus was a Titan by birth, but he had sided with Zeus during the war, preferring cleverness over loyalty. His name means forethought, which sounds noble until you realise it also means he was the kind of person who always said, "I told you so." He was fascinated by the potential of life. He saw the animals roaming the world and thought, not bad, but something's missing. So he knelt beside a riverbank, scooped up a handful of clay, and began shaping something new. He worked slowly, pressing and smoothing the clay until it resembled the shape of a god, upright, fragile, and far too curious. He gave it a face that could frown, a hand that could reach, and a mind that could question. The clay dried in the sun, but it did not yet live. Prometheus looked to the heavens and asked Athena, goddess of wisdom, for help. She leaned down and breathed gently into the figure's mouth. The air shimmered, the clay moved, and just like that humanity began. The first humans were clumsy and wide-eyed. They didn't understand seasons or tools or fire. They trembled at thunder and froze in the dark. Prometheus watched them with something between pity and affection. He wanted them to survive, not just exist. He taught them how to build shelters, how to count stars, how to name the things that frightened them. It wasn't long before he realized that knowledge alone was not enough. They needed warmth, fire, the spark of Olympus, the secret of creation. Zeus had forbidden it. Fire belonged to the gods just as light belonged to the sun. It was dangerous, unpredictable, alive in a way that could not be tamed. Prometheus understood the rule, but he also understood compassion. One night, when Olympus slept beneath a blanket of mist, he crept to the chariot of the sun and lit a torch from its wheel. He carried that flame back to earth, cupped in his hands, and hid it inside a hollow reed. When he returned to the mortal camp, he pressed the torch into the hands of his fragile creations. The fire caught. At first, the people were terrified. The flames leapt and danced, devouring twigs, crackling like laughter. But soon, they gathered around it. They learned how it could cook food, harden clay, and keep beasts away. For the first time, night became optional. Prometheus watched their faces glow in the light, saw them smiling, alive in ways no god had ever been. It was not rebellion that pleased him. It was tenderness. But Olympus noticed. Smoke rose into the sky, thin, grey, and accusing. When Zeus saw it, his face darkened like a gathering storm. He knew what it meant. Someone had broken the boundary between heaven and earth. To Zeus, fire was not just warmth, it was power, the privilege of shaping destiny. He saw Prometheus's act not as mercy, but as theft. Punishment came quickly. Prometheus was taken to the edge of the world, where mountains pierced the clouds. There, he was chained to a rock by Hephaestus's own iron craftsmanship. Every morning an eagle, the symbol of Zeus himself, descended and tore at Prometheus's liver. Every night the wound healed, and every dawn the suffering began again. It was eternity in loops, a punishment designed to match the scale of compassion. Yet even bound, Prometheus never begged for forgiveness. The Greeks saw in him something sacred, defiance in service of love. He wasn't punished for greed or pride, he was punished for caring too much about mortals. His agony became a kind of prayer, the price of enlightenment paid in pain, and the fire, once stolen, could never be returned. It spread from hand to hand, village to village, until it became indistinguishable from life itself. But Zeus, ever thorough, had one more lesson to teach. If Prometheus had gifted humans warmth, then Zeus would gift them consequence. he ordered Hephaestus to mould another figure from clay, not a man this time, but a woman. The other gods adorned her with gifts. Aphrodite gave her beauty, Athena gave her curiosity, Hermes gave her words, too many of them. Her name was Pandora, which means all gifted, though the name would come to sound like a warning. When she was finished, Zeus placed into her hands a jar. Inside were all the things that make life heavy: sorrow, envy, disease, exhaustion. He told her not to open it, which of course ensured that she would. When Pandora lifted the lid, the contents escaped in a whispering rush. The air filled with shadows. From that day forward, humans learned what it meant to ache, to age, to fear. The world was no longer perfect. It was real. But one thing remained at the bottom of the jar. Small, quiet, trembling. It was hope. The poets argued about why it stayed. Some said it was mercy. Others said it was the cruelest joke of all, to hope for a life that can never be without pain. Yet the Greeks, ever pragmatic, chose the softer answer. Hope remained because without it, even gods would despair. Prometheus, still chained, heard about Pandora and her jar. He smiled, or perhaps winced. He had not given fire to make humanity happy. He had given it to make them aware. Knowledge and suffering had always been twins. Fire illuminated not only the world's beauty but also its flaws. That was the trade. And from that balance, warmth and wound, light and loss, civilization was born. The gods watched the mortals below, their fires flickering like stars against the dark. Some pitied them, others envied them. For though humans would die, their days were bright with urgency. Every meal mattered, every sunrise was borrowed time. Immortality, in contrast, was endless repetition, a calendar without meaning. And perhaps, in a way no god would admit, Prometheus had outsmarted them all. Somewhere in the valley a family gathered by their small flame. Children laughed, sparks rose and the night retreated. The gods could punish, but they could not unlearn compassion. The clay had dared to think, and the world would never again be as simple as Olympus preferred. The fire that Prometheus had given to humankind kept burning, and the smoke that rose from it began to tell stories. The Greeks believed the gods watched these, stories the way one might watch candlelight dancing on a wall, fascinated by the movement, but never stepping into the flame. Over time, those stories changed, and so did the world. It didn't happen with sudden explosions or divine decrees. It happened the way seasons change, quietly, almost politely. Each age faded into the next as if the earth was slowly exhaling. The poet Hesiod once described it in a long weary sigh he called the 5 ages of man. The story begins with light and ends in iron, a soft descent from wonder to noise. It is not a tale of punishment, but of transformation. The slow education of a restless species learning what it means to be alive. The first was the Golden Age. In this time, humanity lived under the reign of Cronus, when the world still glowed with the warmth of divine memory. People needed no tools, no walls, no laws. The soil gave fruit without ploughing. The air was mild, the waters kind. No one aged or starved or fought. Death came gently, like sleep after a long afternoon. The Greeks didn't imagine this paradise as perfect joy, but as calm ignorance. They saw it as a dream the world eventually had to wake from. When that age ended, it wasn't with thunder or punishment. It simply faded, like sunlight at dusk. The Silver Age followed, an era of growing pains. The people of this age were beautiful but fragile, like moonlight reflecting on water. They lived long childhoods, carefree and thoughtless, but when adulthood arrived, they forgot the gods and ignored the old rites. They began to build, to measure, to argue. It was not wickedness that doomed them, only neglect, the kind that comes only from growing too comfortable with their own reflection. The gods, patient but not endlessly so, withdrew their protection, and the Silver Age sank beneath its own brightness. The people, once childlike, learned the ache of being left alone. The earth still offered food, but now it demanded effort. The first blisters appeared on human hands. Labour, that quiet teacher of humility, had entered the story. Then came the Bronze Age, an age of invention and impatience. The people of bronze were restless and loud. Their hearts beat fast and their bodies were built for battle. They learned to melt the earth's veins into metal, shaping weapons that could cut not only wood and hide, but also one another. They celebrated the noise of conflict and called it glory. The Greeks saw this not as evil, but as evolution. Each age carried the lessons of the last, and in this one, humanity learned how easily strength becomes cruelty. They built walls, forged armour, and filled the world with the clang of ambition. And though their lives were short, their names began to echo. It was during this time, the poet said, that men first started to pray for heroes, someone who could hold back the tide of chaos they themselves had created. The Bronze Age ended not because of divine punishment, but because its own noise drowned it. Civilization collapsed under the weight of its shouting, and yet even in that collapse something new flickered. From the ashes of exhaustion came the heroic age. This was the briefest of all, but the brightest. The gods, perhaps nostalgic, allowed mortals to rise closer to their own likeness, not flawless, but magnificent in their flaws. The world filled with names that would never truly die: Perseus, Heracles, Theseus, Jason, and countless others whose deeds blurred the line between myth and memory. In this age, courage and tragedy shared the same breath. The Greeks loved it because it was recognisably human, full of effort and heartbreak, triumph and regret. Heroes did not create paradise, they created meaning. When Heracles wrestled monsters or Odysseus argued with the sea, they were simply dramatising what every person already felt: the need to push against something larger, even knowing they would lose. The heroic age was humanity's adolescence, bold, brilliant, exhausting. It ended, as all youth does, not with failure but with time. The gods, having seen enough, withdrew once more, leaving the world to mortals, and thus began the Iron Age, the one Hesiod lived in, and the one he described with the quiet despair of a man who had seen too much. Men will honour strength, he wrote, and shame will vanish. In this age, work was constant, winters were long, and kindness was a rumour. The earth grew stingy, the sky less generous. People built cities, laws, markets, and lies. They learned to measure everything, even love, in terms of cost. They no longer spoke with the gods, only about them. Yet Hesiod's lament carried an undercurrent of strange tenderness. Even as he cursed the Iron Age, he admitted it had one advantage: awareness. The people of iron could remember. They carried inside them the ghosts of gold and silver, the echo of bronze, the whisper of heroes. They had lost ease, but they had gained memory. The Greeks saw that as a kind of redemption, the knowledge that even in decline there is depth. The 5 ages, then, were not steps downward, but circles widening. Each one brought humanity closer to itself. The Golden Age taught peace, the Silver taught curiosity, the Bronze taught strength, the Heroic taught courage, and the Iron taught endurance. It was as if existence were a long conversation between light and shadow, each era answering the previous one with a softer or harsher tone. Some storytellers said that when humans began to work the land and forge iron, the gods looked down with mixed feelings. They saw sweat and hunger, yes, but also creativity. The fires of the forges reminded them of their own celestial lightning. Perhaps they thought this new species had inherited more than expected. Perhaps the clay still held a trace of divine stubbornness. There were whispers that Zeus considered wiping the slate clean. that he toyed with storms and floods and imagined a world reborn, but something restrained him. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe it was curiosity. Mortals, after all, were entertaining. They failed magnificently. They made beauty from despair. Even their prayers when they reached Olympus sounded less like begging and more like poetry. So the gods watched, sometimes amused, sometimes annoyed, as humans stumbled through their iron existence. Down below, people began to tell stories about their ancestors, decorating memory with exaggeration until it shimmered like myth. The lines between history and imagination blurred, and perhaps that was the truest invention of all. If they couldn't live forever, they could at least be remembered. The Greeks saw in this realization the start of something almost holy, the act of storytelling itself. To speak of the Golden Age was not to mourn it, but to recreate it for a heartbeat. Every time a poet recited Hesiod's verses by firelight, the world briefly became golden again. That was their secret hope, that memory could cheat time. When Hesiod ended his poem, he didn't call for rescue or restoration. He simply said, "If only I had not been born in this age." But behind the melancholy there was a small smile, because by saying that he ensured he would be remembered in every age to come. That too was a kind of victory, fragile, ironic, but enough. And so, from gold to iron, the world had not fallen but grown heavier. It had traded perfection for purpose, ease for awareness, innocence for story. The gods still sat above the clouds, drinking nectar, watching mortals with a mix of pity and admiration. They no longer ruled every heartbeat, but they still listened for the sound of prayers carried upward on smoke, the oldest language left between heaven and earth. The fire still burned, and though its glow was dimmer now, it was steadier. Humanity had inherited the burden of survival, and with it, the strange gift of meaning. The gods, it seemed, had stepped back not in anger, but to see what their reflection would do next. The Iron Age had settled in. The world was louder now, full of metal, ambition, and the soft chaos of human imagination. With the gods watching from their clouded balconies, mortals began to dream of being noticed. They built temples, made offerings, told stories in which the line between man and God blurred just enough to make both sides uneasy. From this blur, heroes were born. They weren't perfect, but they were memorable, half mortal, half divine, and entirely exhausting. One of the first was Perseus, a name that sounds like wind cutting through stone. His story began, as many Greek tales did, with an oracle that no one should have listened to. The king of Argos, Acrisius, was told by the oracle at Delphi that his daughter Danae would bear a son destined to kill him. Understandably, he did what every ancient king did when faced with prophecy. He panicked. Acrisius locked his daughter in a bronze chamber, sealed from light and air, certain that fate could be outwitted with architecture. But the gods had other plans. Zeus, curious as ever, visited Danae not in person, but as a shower of golden light, the kind of divine subtlety that makes later philosophers sigh. From that shimmer, Perseus was conceived. When the child was born, Acrisius placed mother and a baby in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, hoping the ocean would solve what the oracle had started. The waves, however, were feeling sentimental that day. They carried the chest gently to the island of Seriphos, where it washed ashore like a forgotten gift. There, a kind fisherman named Dictys found them. He raised Perseus as his own, teaching him the ways of nets and patience, both vital skills for any Greek hero. Time passed, and Perseus grew strong, clever, and entirely too handsome for local peace. His misfortune came when King Polydectes, Dictys's brother, decided he wanted Danae for himself. To rid himself of her protective son, the king demanded a gift worthy of a monarch, the head of a Gorgon. Even in myth, this sounded unreasonable. The Gorgons were ancient creatures with serpents for hair and faces so terrifying that a single glance could turn a man to stone. They lived beyond the edges of the world, past oceans and nightmares. Polydectes might as well have asked for the moon. But Perseus, young and painfully sincere, accepted the challenge. Heroes rarely refused quests. They simply regretted them later. Athena, watching from Olympus, decided to intervene. She admired cleverness, and Perseus at least looked like he might listen to advice. She gave him a polished shield, gleaming like still water. "Don't look at the monster," she told him. "Look at its reflection." It was both strategy and metaphor, the kind the Greeks adored, wisdom wrapped in danger. Hermes, a muse, joined in and lent Perseus a curved sword sharp enough to cut shadow from light. The nymphs provided winged sandals, a helmet of invisibility, and a pouch that could hold a severed head without complaint. The gods, it seemed, enjoyed equipping mortals more than saving them. Perseus set off, flying above deserts and dark seas. The sound of wind through his sandals was the rhythm of fate. At last he reached the land of the Gorgons, where 3 sisters slept among shattered statues, the unlucky men who had looked too directly. Medusa, the youngest, was said to have once been beautiful, until Athena cursed her for desecrating her temple. Now her face was horror itself, but still, the Greeks imagined her weeping in her dreams. Monsters, after all, were rarely born, they were made. Perseus hovered silently, shield angled before him. He walked backward, guided only by reflection, until he stood above her. With one swift movement, one heartbeat's courage, he brought down Hermes's blade. The world went still. Then, from Medusa's blood, something astonishing happened. A winged horse, Pegasus, rose into the sky, followed by a warrior, Chrysaor. The Greeks never agreed on what this meant, only that beauty often bursts from violence, and freedom sometimes demands sacrifice. Perseus placed the head carefully in his pouch, avoiding its gaze. Even severed, it retained power. Proof that fear doesn't die when destroyed. It simply changes form. On his way home, he passed over the coast of Ethiopia, where he saw a woman chained to a rock by the sea. Her name was Andromeda, and she was meant to be sacrificed to a sea monster as punishment for her mother's pride. Perseus, whose life had become a collection of unplanned rescues, descended. With Medusa's head, he turned the monster to stone, freed the girl and married her before anyone could object. The return to Seriphos was less romantic. Polydectes mocked his story, demanding proof. Perseus obliged by presenting the Gorgon's head directly. The king and his court turned to stone mid-laughter, the earliest recorded example of overconfidence meeting consequences. In the years that followed, Perseus returned the magical gifts, built cities, and raised a family. His mother was safe, his enemies defeated, and the gods for once were satisfied. It would have been a perfect ending, except that Greek myths never truly end. They loop back on themselves like old rivers. One day, while competing in a discus game, Perseus threw too far. The discus struck an old man watching from the crowd, his grandfather Acrisius. The prophecy had been fulfilled after all. The Greeks loved this kind of irony. To them, destiny was not cruel, merely efficient. Every attempt to escape it only tightened its threads. Perseus didn't weep, he simply understood. The hero who had conquered monsters had been undone by a casual throw, by chance, or perhaps by balance. In that moment, he stopped being a figure of legend and became something far more interesting, human. The story of Perseus is often told as one of courage and triumph, but the Greeks would have whispered it differently. They would have said it was about learning how to look at horror without losing yourself. Perseus never stared at the monster directly. He used reflection to face what others could not. It was less about victory than perspective. The gods gave him tools, but it was his restraint that saved him. And perhaps that's the quiet truth hidden inside his myth, that sometimes survival is not about defiance but distance, not about slaying the thing you fear, but about knowing how to see it safely. The mirror shield of Athena was more than a weapon. It was the first lesson in wisdom. When facing monsters, look carefully, but never forget to blink. Somewhere high above, the gods watched and nodded. Humanity, it seemed, had learned another trick. The clay that once only dreamed now reflected back the light of its creators, and occasionally it did so with better manners. When mortals began to sing songs about Perseus, the gods listened with the faint amusement of artists being praised for old work. They had not created humanity to be heroic, yet here they were, climbing mountains, wrestling fears and writing epics about it. Zeus in particular seemed entertained by the idea that mortals could mirror the gods' drama on a smaller scale. So as the stories multiplied, he decided to add another one, something louder, heavier, more complicated. It would not be a tale of cleverness or reflection this time, but of endurance. That is how Heracles came to exist, the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene. His name means the glory of Hera, which was ironic since Hera hated him before he was even born. Zeus had disguised himself as Alcmene's husband to conceive the child, and Hera, who had endured more divine affairs than patience allows, decided that if she could not stop Zeus from being unfaithful, she could at least ruin the results. Heracles was marked from birth for both greatness and misery. The Greeks did not romanticize this. To them, Heracles wasn't a hero because he was blessed. He was a hero because he suffered and kept moving. Even as an infant, Hera tried to kill him by sending 2 serpents into his cradle. The story says he strangled them with his bare hands, which is impressive for a baby, though less so for anyone trying to babysit him. As he grew, Heracles became what humans imagined strength looked like when it learned shame. He was massive, kind-hearted, and occasionally terrible. He built cities and broke things, saved people and frightened them, and was as likely to cause a disaster as to fix one. His life was a series of contradictions, divine blood wrapped in human confusion. Hera's hatred followed him like a shadow. She sent madness upon him, a fit so deep that he lost sight of the world. When he woke, his home was silent, and his wife and children lay dead by his own hands. The Greeks didn't explain this away, they accepted it. Their gods were not moral judges, they were weather systems. Hera's storm had passed through him, and the wreckage was all that remained. When he realized what he had done, Heracles did not plead for forgiveness. He went to Delphi to ask the oracle what penance could possibly cleanse such blood. The oracle, always practical, told him to serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae for 12 years. The king, terrified of him, saw an opportunity to stay safe and entertained. He gave Heracles 12 impossible labours, each one meant to destroy him, each one destined to fail. The first was to kill the Nemean lion, a beast with a hide no weapon could pierce. Heracles strangled it with his bare hands, skinned it with its own claws, and wore the pelt as armour. The second was to slay the Linnaean Hydra, a serpent with many heads that regrew 2 for every one cut off. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, he cauterized the stumps, burning the wounds shut so no more could grow. The air stank of smoke and victory. Next, he captured the golden hind of Artemis, a sacred deer so swift it could outrun the wind. Heracles pursued it for a full year before catching it unharmed. The labour after that was filthier, cleaning the stables of King Augeas, where thousands of immortal cattle had been relieving themselves for decades. Heracles diverted 2 rivers through the stables, finished in a day, and invented plumbing out of spite. He fought birds with bronze beaks, a bull that breathed fire, and a herd of man-eating horses. He stole the girdle of the Amazon queen, wrestled the 3-headed dog Cerberus, and fetched golden apples guarded by a dragon. Each task tested a different part of him: strength, endurance, patience, or the ability to take orders from people far less competent than he was. The Greeks loved listing these labours the way modern people list reasons they're tired. To them, It was not about conquest, but repetition. Heracles didn't win once. He won 12 times in a row and still wasn't happy. Every monster slain left a silence he couldn't fill. Power, he discovered, didn't cleanse guilt. It only postponed it. Between his labours, he wandered, sometimes as a saviour, sometimes as a stranger. He founded temples and orphaned villages, loved many and lost more. Every kindness he offered seemed to end in tragedy. Hera's anger never cooled. At one point, she sent him to serve as a slave to a queen named Omphale, forcing him to wear women's clothing and spin wool. The Greeks told this not as humiliation, but as symmetry. Even strength must bow to absurdity. His final labour took him to the underworld. To complete it, he had to capture Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of Hades' gate. He wrestled the beast into submission without weapon or trick, proving that brute force, when guided by will, could walk even among the dead. He returned to the world above, dragging the creature into daylight. For a brief moment, mortals saw what only souls had seen, that death too could be faced and released. When the labours ended, the king who had assigned them still feared him. Heracles, weary of orders, left Mycenae and wandered again. His legend grew, but his body began to break. He married a woman named Deianira, who loved him, but did not trust the god's affection for him. When a dying centaur tricked her into giving Heracles a poisoned robe, she believed it was a charm to preserve his love. When he put it on, the poison burned through his skin. Heracles, unable to bear the pain, built his own funeral pyre. He lay upon it, looked at the sky and laughed, not bitterly but with recognition. Fire, the same gift Prometheus had stolen, would be his last companion. As the flames rose, Zeus intervened one final time. The mortal body burned away, but what was divine in him ascended. The man who had endured everything became a god. The Greeks never worshipped Heracles as flawless. They prayed to him as proof that strength alone was never enough, that endurance mattered more than victory, and that redemption sometimes meant climbing your own pyre. His labours became metaphors for existence itself, endless tasks, mostly unpleasant, done simply because they must be. In later centuries, when artists carved him in marble, they always showed him resting, club in hand, head bowed, muscles heavy. Even in stone he looked tired, not from battle but from being alive, and maybe that's why his story endured. Heracles was not the god of triumph, he was the god of effort, of trying again, even after everything hurts, of carrying the sky for a while, then putting it down gently before someone else must lift it. Somewhere in Olympus, they said, he still sits beside Zeus, finally at peace. The storm that once was Hera's hatred has turned to distant thunder, and below, in the mortal world, the sound of hammers, wheels, and human work continues, a quiet echo of the 12th labour, still unfinished. By the time the songs of Heracles had echoed across the Aegean, Greece had grown older and more complicated. Cities were forming, laws were being invented, and humanity was beginning to understand that monsters didn't always live in caves. Sometimes they built palaces. The age of brute strength was fading. In its place came an age of reason, or at least of people trying to sound reasonable while still doing terrible things. The hero who best fit this transition was Theseus, the man who turned heroism into something like politics. He was the son of a mystery. Some said his father was Aegeus, king of Athens. Others whispered that Poseidon had also visited his mother that night, because in Greek myth, paternity was often a group project. When Theseus grew up, his mother sent him to Athens to claim his heritage. To test him, she placed under a heavy rock the sword and sandals of his supposed father and told him that only when he was strong enough to lift the stone could he seek his destiny. He did, and under it, he found more than weapons. He found purpose. It was a classic Greek metaphor, strength revealing identity, as though meaning itself were buried under effort. On his way to Athens, he refused to travel by sea, which was safer. Instead, he took the road where he could meet the world's unpleasant surprises head-on. The Greeks admired that kind of optimism. Along the way, he encountered a series of bandits and killers who treated travellers like practice targets. Theseus killed them one by one, not out of cruelty but symmetry. He punished each villain with their own method. The stretcher was stretched, the kicker was kicked, the thief was robbed. Justice, in his hands, was not mercy, but mathematics. When he reached Athens, he discovered the city was suffering under the rule of King Minos of Crete, whose son had been killed there years before. To avenge him, Minos demanded that every 9 years Athens send 7 young men and 7 maidens to Crete as tribute. Sacrifices to feed the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, hidden in a labyrinth beneath the Cretan palace. The monster had been born of Minos' own misfortune, a punishment for arrogance, as if the gods had sculpted guilt into flesh. Theseus volunteered to be part of the next offering. His reasoning was as simple as it was insane. Someone needed to stop the cycle, and it might as well be him. When the ship reached Crete, Princess Ariadne, daughter of Minos, saw him and felt that unmistakable Greek mixture of admiration and poor judgment. She fell in love immediately and decided to help. She gave him a ball of thread, simple, unheroic, and profoundly clever. "Unravel this as you go," she said, "then follow it back when you're done." That small gesture turned a death trap into a puzzle. The Greeks adored this moment. They believed intellect was sacred, that wit could sometimes outshine divine favour. When Theseus entered the labyrinth, he didn't shout or boast. He tied one end of the thread to the doorpost, stepped into the darkness, and let the line slip quietly through his fingers. The labyrinth was not just stone. It was a metaphor for thought itself, twisting and doubling back. At its centre, he found the Minotaur sleeping, its breath deep and uneven, like the heartbeat of guilt. The fight was brief. The creature lunged, and Theseus struck with his father's sword. When it fell, the air trembled, and for a moment the maze itself seemed to sigh. Following the thread, he retraced his steps, every turn illuminated by the simple wisdom of not getting lost. He led the other captives out, guided by a string thinner than hope, yet strong enough to outlast fear. Outside, Ariadne waited. They sailed away together, hearts light with victory and possibility. But like most Greek endings, this one dissolved on the horizon. On the island of Naxos, Theseus left Ariadne behind. The poets disagreed on why. Some said he loved her, but was told by a dream that the gods had claimed her for Dionysus. Others said he simply forgot her while counting the sails. Either way, the sea carried her sorrow into eternity, and Theseus continued homeward. Before he left Crete, he had promised his father, Aegeus, that if he returned alive, he would hoist white sails instead of black as a sign of triumph. But in his excitement or his grief, he forgot. When the dark sails appeared on the horizon, Aegeus, watching from the cliffs, believed his son dead. In despair, he leapt into the sea, which from that day carried his name, the Aegean. It was a tragedy shaped not by malice, but by oversight, the kind of mistake that feels painfully human. When Theseus arrived, the people crowned him king. He was a hero who ruled, and a ruler who tried to be heroic. Never an easy combination. He united the scattered villages of Attica into a single city, giving birth to the idea of Athens itself. His reign was long, ambitious, and full of arguments. He founded laws, festivals, and reforms. The Greeks credited him with inventing what we now call civilization, though that may have been just another of their poetic exaggerations. Yet, even kings grow restless. In later years, Theseus's life unravelled much like his thread. His friendship soured, his people turned distant, and his idealism thinned. He had faced monsters of flesh, but not the ones of memory. Eventually he died not in battle, but in exile, pushed from a cliff by those who had once cheered for him. The gods, merciful or perhaps simply nostalgic, welcomed him quietly into the afterlife. The Greeks didn't mourn him with tears. They said his legacy lived in the stones of Athens, in the way laws bend but never break, in the delicate balance between courage and reason. To them, Theseus represented a different kind of strength, the strength to think before striking, to measure before acting, and to accept that every victory leaves a shadow. His thread, they said, was never truly lost. It runs invisibly through time, through every maze of uncertainty, every tangle of thought. When people find their way out of confusion, when they solve something that once frightened them, they are following a little piece of his line. And maybe that's what the gods had intended all along, to watch their reflections learn not just how to fight, but how to think. The world had enough lions and monsters. What it needed now was a mind sharp enough to navigate its own labyrinths. Theseus had offered that gift, and the price, as always, was loneliness. By the time Theseus had ruled and fallen, Greece had grown fond of stories about voyages. The sea had always been its oldest companion, unpredictable, glittering, and patient enough to watch every generation repeat the same mistakes. The people who lived along its shores believed that destiny was something you could sail toward if your courage was foolish enough. And in one of those long, shimmering myths of salt and pride, they told the story of Jason, a hero who learned that the hardest thing to navigate is not the ocean, but the heart. Jason's tale began, as most tragedies do, with family trouble. His father Aeson had been king of Iolcus until his half-brother Peleus usurped the throne. Peleus, as with all Greek kings blessed with ambition and anxiety, sought reassurance from the oracle. He was told to beware of a man wearing one sandal. Naturally, when Jason arrived years later, young, confident, and missing a shoe after helping an old woman across a river, who inconveniently turned out to be the goddess Hera in disguise, Peleus recognized the type of man or prophecy that ruins everything. To rid himself of this polite threat, Peleus offered a bargain. "Bring me the golden fleece," he said, "and you may have my throne." The fleece was no ordinary hide. It belonged to a sacred ram that had once carried 2 children across, the sky shining like sunlight woven into wool. It hung now in a faraway land called Colchis, guarded by a serpent that never slept. The request was not a challenge. It was a death sentence disguised as diplomacy. Jason, either too brave or too easily flattered, accepted. He gathered a crew, the Argonauts, named after their ship, Argo. It was a vessel built with wood from a talking oak, a detail that tells you how Greek storytelling worked. Everything, even the furniture, had opinions. Among his companions were Heracles, Orpheus, and a crowd of heroes who would each demand their own songs later. Together they rowed east, following the whisper of the waves. The journey itself was a patchwork of marvels and mistakes. They faced clashing rocks that smashed ships like toys, harpies that shrieked over cursed meals, and islands where kindness came with strings attached. Every challenge was solved not by muscle, but by timing, charm, or luck. The real holy trinity of human survival. Through it all, Jason remained handsome, diplomatic, and quietly uncertain. He wasn't born to be a warrior like Heracles or a thinker like Odysseus. He was something more ordinary, a man trying to appear heroic while improvising. When they reached Colchis, they met King Aeetes, who guarded the Golden Fleece like a banker guards bad investments. The king agreed to hand it over if Jason could yoke fire-breathing bulls, plough a field with them, and sow it with dragon's teeth that would sprout into armed soldiers. It was a task so elaborate it felt personal. Jason accepted, mostly because turning down a king in his own palace is bad manners. Enter Medea, the king's daughter, priestess of Hecate, and a woman whose intelligence shone brighter than any hero's sword. The gods, who loved a chaotic romance, made her fall in love with Jason at first sight. Love in Greek mythology was never a gentle thing. It arrived like a fever, swift, disorienting, and fatal to common sense. Medea, caught in it, betrayed her father, her country, and her future in exchange for a stranger's promise. She gave Jason a salve to protect him from the bull's fire and taught him how to defeat the soldiers born from dragons' teeth. "Throw a stone among them," she said, "and they'll fight each other instead." The Greeks admired her practicality. The next morning, Jason did exactly as she told him. The bulls raged, the earth smoked, the soldiers sprang from the soil and immediately began arguing to death. By sunset, the field was silent, but King Aias, not known for grace, refused to honour his word. So Medea took Jason to the grove where the fleece hung, shimmering like dawn in the branches of an oak. She lulled the serpent to sleep with herbs and song, and Jason took the prize. Together they fled Colchis in the night, chased by the king's ships. To delay pursuit, Medea did something unspeakable. She killed her own brother, scattering his pieces across the sea so her father would be forced to stop and collect them. It was the darkest form of love, devotion sharpening into madness. When they returned to Iolcus, Jason presented the fleece to Peleus, expecting applause. Instead, the king smirked. He had never intended to keep his promise. Medea, realizing this, smiled back and invented revenge. Using her knowledge of spells, she convinced Peleus's daughters that she could restore their father's youth. She demonstrated by cutting up an old ram, boiling it with herbs, and producing a lively lamb. Convinced, the daughters did the same to their father. The pot bubbled, but Peleus did not return. Jason, horrified yet complicit, fled with Medea to Corinth, hoping for peace. Peace never arrives in Greek myth. Years passed and Jason grew restless. He planned to marry the princess of Corinth, a political match that would secure his throne. Medea, betrayed twice now by family and love, prepared her last act. On the wedding day, she sent the bride a gown and crown laced with invisible fire. When the princess put them on, the flames consumed her and the palace around her. And then, in the most terrible silence of all, Medea turned to her children, Jason's sons, and took them too, saying, "No one will call them slaves." The poets never softened this ending. They didn't excuse her or praise her. They simply let the smoke rise. Medea fled in a chariot drawn by dragons, leaving Jason alone among ashes, the golden fleece limp in his hands. He had everything he wanted once: adventure, glory, love. But in gaining them, he had destroyed the meaning of each. The Greeks saw this story not as caution, but as observation. They understood that ambition and desire, when mixed, burn like oil and flame. Jason wanted to prove himself. Medea wanted to belong. Together they created tragedy. Their myth was less about punishment than inevitability. The simple rule that fire, once lit, consumes what it touches. Years later, old and forgotten, Jason sat beneath the rotting hull of the Argo. A beam broke loose, struck him, and killed him instantly. It was almost tender, the ship reclaiming its captain. The Greeks like that kind of symmetry, the past folding neatly over the present. Some say the gods pitied him, others that they looked away. But the sea, endless and impartial, carried his story onward. It lapped at every shore, whispering that heroism and hubris are the same current, beautiful, dangerous, and never still. There are cities in Greece whose stones remember too much, and none remember more than Thebes. It stood inland, away from the sea's forgiving noise, and its stories always seemed to end badly. Even its foundation was cursed. The Greeks said that Thebes was born not from harmony but from the teeth of a dragon, which explains a great deal about its history. It was the city of riddles, prophecies, and lessons that always came too late. Its first founder, Cadmus, wasn't even looking for a city. He was searching for his sister, Europa, who had been carried away by Zeus, though carried away might be too polite for what the king of gods usually did. The oracle told Cadmus to stop searching and to follow a cow until it lay down. There he was to build a city. He obeyed, because in Greece, even the strangest instructions might lead to destiny. When he tried to draw water from a nearby spring, he met the dragon that guarded it. He killed it, buried its body, and on Athena's advice sowed its teeth into the earth. From those teeth rose armed men, the Spartoi, the sown ones. They attacked each other immediately because Theban myths always began with blood. 5 survived, and together they built the city. From that moment, Thebes carried the echo of conflict in its walls, as if its bricks remembered that they had been grown from war. Cadmus reigned for years, but peace never lasted long in that place. His descendants seemed to inherit the dragon's restlessness. Each generation tried to do better, and each managed something worse. Several generations later, a prophecy emerged, as they always did when someone's happiness lasted too long. King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes were told that their son would kill his father and marry his mother. They tried to outwit the gods by abandoning the child on a mountainside. The baby's ankles were pierced and tied together, hence his name Oedipus, the swollen-footed. But fate, being patient, simply took the longer route. A shepherd found the child and brought him to Corinth, where the king and queen, childless and kind, raised him as their own. Oedipus grew up clever, proud, and devoted to order, a man who believed that intelligence could outthink destiny. When the oracle at Delphi later told him he would kill his father and marry his mother, he left Corinth immediately, determined never to return. He would do anything to avoid fulfilling such horror. In his haste, he met an older man on the road. Neither would yield the right of way. Pride escalated, as it often does, into tragedy. In a moment of rage, Oedipus struck the man down. He didn't know that the man was Laius, the king of Thebes, his real father. Unaware, he continued on his path, arriving at a city tormented by a riddle. Outside Thebes sat the Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the voice of a judge. She devoured anyone who failed to answer her question. When Oedipus arrived, she asked, "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening?" He thought for only a moment before replying, "A man who crawls as a child, walks upright in youth, and leans on a staff in age." The Sphinx screamed and threw herself from the cliff, defeated. Thebes, freed from terror, welcomed Oedipus as saviour. They crowned him king and offered him the widowed queen Jocasta as wife. The prophecy, quiet until now, smiled and waited. Years passed. The city prospered. They had children. The air of Thebes, however, never forgave happiness. A plague came, turning fields grey and hearts hollow. The oracle said the city was cursed because the murderer of Laius lived within its walls. Oedipus, dutiful and relentless, vowed to find the culprit. He called witnesses, interrogated priests, demanded answers. Bit by bit, the truth crept closer, until it was too close to bear. Jocasta saw it first and begged him to stop, but he couldn't. The hero's flaw, the Greeks said, was not pride or passion, but curiosity without caution. At last, the old shepherd who had once carried the infant spoke. The baby he had saved was Oedipus himself. The man Oedipus had killed on the road was his father. The woman he shared a bed and crown with was his mother. The prophecy had not been avoided. It had simply been fulfilled on schedule. The Greeks told this moment with astonishing calm. Oedipus did not cry out or curse the gods. He understood. He took the pins from Jocasta's dress, for she had already hanged herself in shame, and blinded himself. "I have seen too much," he said, and the city that once crowned him now turned its eyes away. He left Thebes, guided by his daughter Antigone, wandering until the gods took pity and ended his suffering. The story did not end there, because Thebes never allowed endings. Antigone, brave and stubborn, later defied a new king, Creon, who forbade her to bury her brother. She did so anyway, saying that divine law was older than human law. For that, she was buried alive. Her name, in Greek, means born against, which suited her perfectly. To the Greeks, this entire cycle was not merely tragedy but philosophy. They saw in it the limits of knowledge. Oedipus was the man who solved riddles, who saw clearly and yet was blind to himself. His story was a warning whispered through centuries that wisdom and ruin share the same thread, and pulling it too far unravels both. Thebes stood through it all, a city heavy with the weight of understanding. Even its ruins seemed to think. Travellers said that when the wind passed through the gates at dusk, it sounded like a sigh, as if the stones were whispering, "We told you so." The Greeks loved that kind of ending. Not punishment, not reward, just recognition. The truth, they believed, does not set you free. It simply leaves you standing in the ruins, eyes open at last. And so, the story of Thebes came to rest, or rather to pause. Its people had learned every lesson a city could learn, that curiosity cuts both ways, that prophecy is never early or late, and that sometimes the only mercy the gods offer is understanding. Somewhere beyond the hills, the sea still glittered. Heroes would rise again, wars would burn, and poets would sing. But for now, the wind through Thebes carried the sound of silence, the kind that comes after an answer too heavy to bear. Time, 1 farms. It began, as world-ending things often do, with something small and glittering. A golden apple, polished until it caught the light like mischief itself. It was thrown by Eris, the goddess of discord, the one who never received invitations because everyone knew she would come anyway. The occasion was a wedding among the gods, this sort of event where immortals gather to drink, gossip, and pretend not to compare themselves. Eris, predictably uninvited, rolled her little gift into the crowd. Upon it were 3 words: for the fairest. The apple landed among Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, 3 goddesses who could tolerate anything except uncertainty about who looked better. A quarrel followed that made thunder seem polite. Zeus, wisely unwilling to choose between wife, daughter, and occasional acquaintance, delegated the decision. He selected a mortal judge, hoping distance would make the problem vanish. It did not. The mortal was Paris, Prince of Troy. Young, handsome, and doomed from the moment he agreed to listen. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised political power, Athena offered wisdom and victory in war, and Aphrodite, leaning in with the kind of confidence that wins all arguments, promised him the most beautiful woman alive. Paris chose beauty, as mortals usually do when offered it at a discount. The apple was hers, and the price would be everyone else's. The woman in question was Helen, Queen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus, and daughter of Zeus. Whether she went with Paris willingly or was stolen depends on who tells the story. The Greeks said she was taken. The Trojans said she followed. The truth, as always, sits somewhere between escape and abduction. Either way, when she sailed east across the Aegean, the sea changed colour. The calm before war never lasts long. Back in Greece, the suitors who had once courted Helen remembered the oath they had sworn before her marriage. A pact designed to keep peace, now functioning as a recruitment list. Each man had promised to defend the chosen husband against any threat to their shared pride. When Menelaus called, they came. Agamemnon, his brother, took command. Odysseus, despite claiming to be retired, joined reluctantly. Achilles, half divine and wholly restless, came with his friend Patroclus. And so the greatest army in myth assembled for the pettiest of reasons. Someone lost an argument about a fruit. The fleet gathered at Aulis, a forest of masts waiting for wind. But the gods, who enjoyed drama, sent none. The ships sat motionless, their sails drooping like unspoken doubt. The prophet Calchas announced that Artemis was offended, perhaps by Agamemnon's arrogance, or perhaps simply bored. To appease her, the king was told he must sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. The Greeks always balanced their equations in blood. Agamemnon hesitated. Then, like every general who convinces himself that cruelty is duty, he agreed. Iphigenia was brought to the altar. The poets say she went willingly, though that seems unlikely. The wind rose at last, as if the gods exhaled. The ships moved forward, white sails snapping, the first sound of war carried by the same air that had required such a price. Even the weather, it seemed, demanded a bribe. The Greeks landed on the shores of Troy and built their camp. Across the plain stood the city itself, golden walls, towers bright with sun, and gates that had seen centuries of peace. The Trojans looked out and saw not enemies but inevitability. Paris, meanwhile, admired his own decisions. He had traded a kingdom's safety for affection, and found himself surrounded by both. The Greeks never blamed him entirely. After all, they said, the gods had started it. Humans merely finished the paperwork. The first years of war blurred together. The siege dragged on, turning heroes into bureaucrats of death. Skirmishes replaced battles, arguments replaced strategy. The gods divided their loyalties like gamblers at a dice table. Hera and Athena backed Greece. Aphrodite and Apollo favoured Troy. Zeus pretended neutrality, which mostly meant he napped. On Olympus, the war was entertainment. On Earth, it was erosion. Inside Troy, Helen walked the walls and watched both sides destroy themselves over her. She wept sometimes, though the poets never agreed whether it was for guilt or boredom. Perhaps both. The Greeks had imagined her as divine beauty, but divinity comes with isolation. To be loved by everyone is to be known by no one. Among the soldiers, stories circulated of duels fought at dawn, of gods appearing in disguise, of ships burned and rebuilt. The war consumed youth and gave back only names. In the evenings, the campfires of the Greeks glowed like a second constellation. The Trojans could see them from the ramparts, flickering across the plain, and must have wondered how long light could last before turning to ash. For Agamemnon, victory became an obsession. For Odysseus, it became a puzzle. For Achilles, it was a test of ego. But none of them yet understood that Troy would not fall because of strength or strategy. It would fall because every promise made before it began, of love, loyalty, justice, was already breaking. The war had become a mirror in which gods and men saw the same flaw, pride. And yet, within that flaw, there was still something tragically human, the refusal to let go of beauty even when it burns. The Greeks didn't tell these stories to glorify battle, they told them as confession. The Iliad begins not with triumph, but with rage, the kind that blinds, isolates and devours its own reason. And at the centre of that storm stood Achilles, waiting for his turn to lose everything. For now, though, the war still glittered. The sea still carried songs of armour being polished, horses snorting, bronze clashing, and the distant sound of Helen's name whispered through camps like a curse that no one wanted to end. The golden apple, once small, enough to fit in a hand, had rolled across continents, gathering nations in its path. It had become an idea, that desire could be measured in victory, that love could justify anything, that beauty was worth burning for. The Greeks, of course, knew better, but knowing rarely changes what people do. And somewhere, far above the clouds, Eris smiled. She hadn't started a war. She'd only reminded the world how easily it could start one itself. The war that began with a golden apple had stretched into its 10th year. The sun had burned the same dust 1,000 times, and still the ships waited along the shore like patient vultures. Troy stood behind its walls, proud but tired. The Greeks waited outside, fierce but just as weary. Even glory, it turned out, could go stale. The war had become a habit, one no one knew how to quit. Among the soldiers, one name carried the weight of thunder, Achilles, half mortal, half divine, all restless. His mother, Thetis, had dipped him in the river Styx as a child, holding him by the heel, a detail that would later ruin him. He was the best of the Greeks, the fastest, the strongest, and the least interested in rules. His presence made the army feel immortal. His temper made them wish they weren't. The Greeks were led by Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus, and self-proclaimed commander of everything that breathed. He ruled through obligation and stubbornness, the kind of man who mistook volume for leadership. Achilles obeyed him only because there were Trojans left to fight. When Agamemnon took Briseis, a captured woman who had been Achilles' prize of war, the fragile balance snapped. Achilles refused to fight. He sat in his tent by the sea, polishing his armour like a man waiting for the world to apologise. The Iliad begins there, not at the start of the war, but in its exhaustion. Homer didn't need to tell how it began. Everyone already knew. What mattered was how long people could stay angry before breaking. The camp around Achilles grew quiet, like a house where no one dares to speak above a whisper. Outside, men died. Inside, the greatest warrior stared at the waves, wondering if pride was a wound that ever healed. Without Achilles, the Greeks faltered. The Trojans pushed forward, their prince Hector leading them, noble, steady, everything Achilles was not. Hector fought for his city and his family, not for glory. He was the kind of hero poets wrote about when they wanted to believe in kindness. The gods, of course, couldn't resist choosing sides. Athena whispered strategy to the Greeks. Apollo guided Trojan arrows. Hera insulted everyone. Olympus was less a divine council than a row of gossipy balconies overlooking a neighbourhood dispute. When word came that the Greeks were losing, Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, could bear it no longer. He begged to fight in Achilles' place, wearing his friend's armour to frighten the enemy. Achilles agreed, though he knew the gesture smelled of tragedy. He told him, "Drive them away, but do not take the city." It was the kind of instruction no one in a story ever follows. Patroclus entered battle, blazing in borrowed glory. The Greeks rallied, thinking their champion had returned. The Trojans wavered. Even Hector hesitated until he saw through the disguise. When Patroclus fell beneath Hector's spear, the world seemed to pause. The air itself mourned. In the Greek camp, Achilles heard the news and made no sound. He fell to his knees, his grief so heavy that even the sea answered. His mother came to him, shimmering like foam. He told her he would die soon. She said she already knew. Grief changed him. The rage that had once been pride became purpose. He returned to battle not as a soldier but as something elemental. Fire given shape. The poet said his roar carried across the plain and made rivers retreat. The gods stopped watching and started hiding. He killed Hector in single combat, chasing him 3 times around the city walls before striking him down. When it was over, he tied the body to his chariot and dragged it behind his horse. The Greeks cheered, but the sound was hollow. Victory, when fueled by sorrow, tastes like ash. For days, Achilles refused to return Hector's body. He sat by his tent again, watching it rot. The soldiers avoided him. Even the gods grew uneasy. It was Apollo who finally intervened, whispering to Zeus that cruelty, even divine cruelty, must have a limit. And so Hermes, the messenger, guided an old man through the camp one night, King Priam, Hector's father. He entered Achilles' tent alone, fell to his knees and kissed the hands that had killed his son. "Remember your own father," Priam said. That was all. Achilles looked at the old man and saw for the first time the face of something larger than rage. Grief reflected back at him, aged and human. He wept. He returned Hector's body. The 2 men ate together, sharing bread in silence. Outside, the war continued, but inside that tent for one night, mercy held the world still. The Greeks understood that moment better than most. To them, Achilles wasn't a hero to worship. He was a mirror of how easily strength becomes isolation, how anger, if fed too long, eats the one who holds it. His story was not about killing, but about learning to stop. Rage, they believed, needed pity to breathe. The Iliad ends there, not with Troy's fall, but with Hector's burial. The war remains unfinished because wars rarely end cleanly. They fade like fire cooling to embers. Achilles would die soon after, struck by an arrow to his heel, the one place the river had not touched. Some said Apollo guided it, as if to remind mortals that perfection, even divine perfection, is always incomplete. But before that, for a fleeting moment, Achilles had been both beast and man, thunder and forgiveness, a contradiction wrapped in bronze. The Greeks saw that and called it beauty, not the shining kind, but the painful kind that comes from understanding too late. When the storytellers recited his tale, they did it softly, as though trying not to wake him. They said that somewhere beyond the fields of war, his ghost still walks by the sea at night, listening to the waves that once mirrored his silence. Perhaps he's waiting for another old man to remind him that compassion too is a kind of victory. And so, the greatest warrior of Greece was remembered not for his conquests, but for the moment he chose to let go. In that single gesture, the gods' endless quarrels quieted for a heartbeat, and humanity learned something simple, that even in the age of heroes, mercy was the only act worth singing twice. The war had grown tired of itself. 10 years of battles, speeches and promises had eroded every illusion of glory. Even the gods seemed distracted. The fields around Troy were littered with the quiet ruins of heroism. Broken spears, cracked helmets, half-buried bones. The Greeks were still outside the walls, the Trojans still inside, and both sides were waiting for someone clever enough, or desperate enough, to end it. That someone, of course, was Odysseus, a man who preferred ideas to swordsmanship and could turn a compliment into a strategy. He had survived 10 years of futility mostly by observing that humans, even divine ones, tend to fall for the same tricks: pride, hope, and a good story. He looked at the stalemate and decided that if strength had failed, perhaps imagination could finish the job. The plan began with a lie disguised as a gift, an art form Odysseus had perfected. The Greeks pretended to give up. They burned their camp, pushed their ships out to sea, and left behind a massive wooden horse, hollow as an apology. On its flank they carved a dedication to Athena in gratitude for victory. It was the kind of thank you that made the gods suspicious but flattered all the same. The Trojans, peering from their walls, saw no army, only a monument. They argued, as cities do, about what it meant. Some said it was a peace offering, others called it a trap. Cassandra, the prophet cursed to be believed by no one, cried out that it was death in disguise. No one listened. Prophets are rarely invited to vote. Laercon, a priest, tried to drive a spear into the horse's side, but before anyone could join him, 2 serpents rose from the sea, gifts from Poseidon, or perhaps just the sea being itself again. The snakes wrapped around the priest and his sons, crushing them until the city's doubt collapsed into fear. Clearly, they said, the gods want us to bring it inside. So they did. The gates opened. The horse was dragged through, wheels groaning, ropes straining, its hollow belly whispering. The Trojans built fires, poured wine, and celebrated the miracle of survival. They toasted to peace, to luck, to beauty. After 10 years of siege, the sound of laughter was strange, too bright, too loud, like sunlight after rain. The city glowed that night, gold on gold, unaware that the darkness it feared had simply changed shape. Inside the horse, in the cramped silence of its ribs, Greek soldiers waited. Odysseus was among them, counting heartbeats instead of hours. He had gambled everything on a single night. That sleep would come to the victors faster than suspicion. Outside, the streets emptied. The music slowed. Drunken voices softened into snores. When the moon climbed high enough to see her reflection on Troy's rooftops, Odysseus whispered the signal. The trapdoor opened. They emerged quietly, barefoot over marble, their swords drawn but patient. They slipped to the gates and opened them for the fleet, which had returned under cover of dark. The city woke to fire. The Greeks poured in like a tide with no intention of retreat. Houses burned, temples cracked, and statues that had watched centuries of prayer finally saw the truth of it, that devotion is only safe until envy learns your address. Priam, the old king, was cut down beside his altar, and in a corner of the palace, Cassandra clung to the statue of Athena, whispering her final warnings to no one who cared to listen. The poet said her voice lingered there for years, a ghost murmuring through the broken stone. The Greeks won, if winning is the right word for what remained. Helen was reclaimed, though reclaimed is another polite fiction. Menelaus, seeing her again, raised his sword, but it fell from his hand. She smiled, not with joy, but with exhaustion. She had survived 10 years of bloodshed by being beautiful. The Greeks carried her away, and no one asked whether she wanted to go. As dawn broke, the fires of Troy dimmed to smoke. Odysseus walked among the ruins, his triumph already turning heavy. He had ended the war, yes, but what he saw didn't look like peace. It looked like a question with no answer. What happens after victory? The Greeks looted, argued, and burned what little remained. Some were cursed before they even reached their ships. The air smelled of ash and regret, a scent the sea would carry for centuries. One man, Aeneas, fled the city carrying his father on his shoulders and his son by the hand. He didn't look back. The gods whispered that he would build another city someday, far away, and that from his ashes an empire would rise. It was a comforting rumour, the idea that destruction might still have purpose. But for the people left behind, there was no prophecy, only silence. The Greeks packed what they could and sailed for home, leaving behind the ghost of a city that would never stop burning in memory. Even the gods, tired of the noise, turned away. Some claimed they had wept. Others said they had simply lost interest. War, after all, is exhausting even for immortals. The story of Troy became a mirror held up to every age that followed. It was retold not as warning, but as ritual, the same tale of cleverness mistaken for wisdom, victory mistaken for justice. The Greeks, for all their brilliance, understood how fragile intelligence could be when paired with desire. They knew that minds as sharp as Odysseus's were also capable of cruelty disguised as logic. They saw that every city built on pride carries its own wooden horse somewhere in its foundations, waiting for the right night to open. When bards sang the fall of Troy, their voices softened at the end, like a flame running out of breath. They didn't shout triumph, they whispered. They said the smoke rose so high it brushed the feet of the gods, who did not move. They said that Eris, goddess of discord, smiled once more, not in malice, but in recognition. The game was over, and as always, everyone had lost. The Greeks sailed away into the pale dawn, their ships creaking under spoils and ghosts. Behind them, the sea swallowed the reflection of the burning city. It is said that on calm nights, when the water is still enough to show the stars, you can see faint embers floating there. The last sparks of a war that refused to end, still drifting quietly beneath the surface of time. The sea does not remember victory. It remembers the weight of ships, the salt of tears, and the silence that follows when trumpets finally stop. After the fall of Troy, the waves became graveyards of bronze, wood, and rumour. The Greeks had won a war, but every sail that turned homeward carried something heavier than spoils. The gods had gone quiet again, and the long journey home, Nostos, the return, began with wind that sounded like doubt. Agamemnon, king of kings, led the first fleet to leave. His ship cut through the water like a scar reopening. He had sacrificed his daughter to start the war. Now he returned to a wife who had learned patience the hard way. Clytemnestra had waited 10 years, and her grief had hardened into calculation. When Agamemnon arrived, she greeted him with smiles and carpets of crimson, a gesture so extravagant it should have felt wrong. She led him into the palace, offered him wine, and while he bathed, struck him down with an axe. The poets said it was justice, others said it was geometry, every act finding its equal opposite. In the end, his blood flowed across the same red cloth she had laid in welcome. Orestes, their son, would later avenge him, killing his own mother and being pursued across the world by the Furies, spirits of vengeance older than law itself. His story would end not with punishment but with a trial, the first ever held by mortals, where Athena herself cast the deciding vote for mercy. It was perhaps the beginning of civilization, the moment rage agreed to follow rules. Elsewhere, Menelaus, who had started the war for his stolen wife, drifted from shore to shore. Helen was beside him, beautiful and silent, as though made of the same light that reflected off the sea. Some said she had been replaced by a phantom during the war, that the real Helen had waited in Egypt untouched. Menelaus never confirmed this. The Greeks were comfortable with paradox. If both versions hurt, both could be true. He and Helen finally returned to Sparta, where they lived uneasily, surrounded by the noise of their legend. When travellers visited, they stared at her the way people look at fire, awed, grateful, and slightly afraid. But the most famous homecoming belonged to Odysseus, the man of many turns, who had ended Troy with an idea and now found that cleverness could not calm the sea. His voyage lasted 10 years, another lifetime of storms, islands, and almost endings. Each stop along his route felt less like an adventure and more like a test written by someone who enjoyed seeing what a human mind could endure. First came the land of the Lotus Eaters, where the fruit made men forget their purpose. Odysseus dragged his crew back to the ships by force, because to forget is another kind of death. Then came the Cyclops, a giant with one eye and a bad attitude. Odysseus tricked him, calling himself nobody, and escaped by clinging to the bellies of sheep. As his ship sailed away, he couldn't resist shouting his real name back, so the story would be told. The gods, who disliked good endings, made note of that pride. Next came Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, who gave Odysseus a bag containing every breeze except the one he needed. His crew, suspecting treasure, opened it. The winds roared free, and the ships were flung back to where they began. The Greeks understood this perfectly. They knew that the shortest distance between success and disaster is usually curiosity. Circe followed, the sorceress who turned men into pigs, a transformation Odysseus's sailors took with suspicious ease. With her help, he later journeyed to the underworld, speaking to ghosts who asked only to be remembered. Achilles told him, better to be a slave on earth than a king among the dead. Odysseus listened, but he was already half a ghost himself, one foot in myth, the other in longing. When he left Circe, he sailed past the sirens, whose songs promised knowledge but offered only drowning. He plugged his men's ears with wax and had himself tied to the mast, wanting to hear temptation safely. The Greeks admired this scene, not the resistance but the arrangement. It was wisdom with rope included. They understood that curiosity must sometimes be restrained by force. Then came Scylla and Charybdis, a monster with 6 heads, and a whirlpool that swallowed ships whole. Between them Odysseus steered, losing some men but saving most. When he told this story later, he left out the screams. Heroic summaries are tidier that way. After years adrift, his ship broke on the shores of Ogygia, the island of Calypso. She loved him, offered immortality, and kept him for 7 years. He declined both her love and eternity. Immortality, he had learned, was simply another form of exile. The gods, moved or bored, finally ordered his release. At last, half drowned and fully human, he washed ashore in Ithaca, his homeland. He found his house overrun with suitors eating his food and courting his wife, Penelope, who had spent 2 decades weaving and unweaving the same tapestry, her clever resistance to remarriage. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus entered, strung his old bow and restored his home the only way the gods seemed to understand, through violence. When Penelope saw him, she did not rush to embrace him. She tested him with a riddle, asking him to move their marriage bed, which he knew was impossible, for it had been carved into the trunk of a living olive tree. Only then did she believe. They stood together in silence, not like lovers reuniting after a long journey, but like 2 survivors acknowledging that the storm had finally stopped lying. Odysseus's return was not triumph, it was recognition. That home is never what you left, and the person returning is never the same. The Greeks called that bittersweet ache nostos, from which we get nostalgia, though the word once meant something heavier, the pain of surviving long enough to remember. As dawn rose over Ithaca, Odysseus looked out at the sea one last time. It was calm, obedient, almost kind. But somewhere deep beneath its surface, Troy still burned in reflection. Every wave that reached the shore carried a trace of that distant fire. He turned away. The gods had fallen silent again. The age of heroes was ending, and the world was learning to live without witnesses. The sea, patient as ever, kept the stories. All the grief, all the cleverness, all the laughter. It would whisper them to sailors for centuries to come, until memory and myth became indistinguishable. Because in the end, the Greeks understood something profound and quietly tragic. No one truly goes home. They only arrive somewhere else with the same longing carried forward. Long after the spears had rusted and the songs of war grew faint, another kind of story began to spread through Greece, one that was not about conquest or kingship, but about release. It came on the wind in laughter, in the smell of crushed grapes and rain-soaked soil. It belonged to Dionysus, the god who arrived uninvited, wearing ivy and a smile that promised either joy or ruin. Dionysus was not born politely. His mother, Semele, was mortal, and his father, as always in these complications, was Zeus. Hera discovered the affair and decided to improve her mood by ending someone else's. She tricked Semele into asking Zeus to reveal himself in his full divine form. When he did, lightning consumed her. Yet from that fire, Zeus snatched the unborn child and sewed him into his thigh, an image the poets delivered calmly as though it explained everything. Months later, Dionysus was born again, making him the only god twice born. That small detail, the Greeks said, was important. It meant he understood both life and what comes after. From the beginning, he was not like the others. The Olympian stood tall and distant, content with order and hierarchy. Dionysus walked barefoot among mortals, wild-haired, soft-voiced, and oddly persuasive. He didn't demand worship. He invited it. And when people refused, he didn't punish them with fire or famine. He gave them something more dangerous, themselves. His followers were called the Maenads, women who left their homes to wander mountains in ecstatic dances, their eyes lit by moonlight and wine. They tore through forests, sang to unseen music, and swore they could feel the heartbeat of the earth. The Greeks both feared and envied them. The idea that divinity might be found not in temples but in frenzy was deeply unsettling. Dionysus's rites, the Bacchic mysteries, promised transformation, and transformation is always a little terrifying. In the city of Thebes, long after Oedipus's dust had settled, a new king rose, Pentheus. He ruled with logic and discipline, 2 qualities that have rarely survived religion. When word reached him that women were abandoning their looms and husbands to dance in the woods, he called it madness and swore to put an end to it. Dionysus, amused, decided to visit him in person. He came disguised as a mortal stranger, graceful and smiling, carrying nothing but a staff wrapped in ivy. Pentheus mocked him, calling him effeminate, deceitful, dangerous, which, to be fair, he was. but Dionysus only laughed softly and invited him to see the truth for himself. The king, curious and suspicious, agreed. The god suggested he dress as a woman to blend among the Maenads. Pentheus, caught between pride and fascination, complied. The scene that followed was one of those moments the Greeks loved for its slow inevitability. In the hills, under the pines, Pentheus watched the dances. Women spinning, shouting, their joy fierce enough to unsettle the air. He saw them not as wild, but free, and for a moment, something in him loosened. But the disguise slipped, the illusion broke, and they saw a man among them. In their ecstasy, they mistook him for prey. The poets say Dionysus vanished into the air as the Maenads tore Pentheus apart. His mother, Agave, was among them, holding his head high in triumph until the trance faded and she saw what she carried. The Greeks didn't tell this as horror. They told it as revelation, not that frenzy was good, but that repression was worse. Dionysus was not cruelty, he was mirror. His worshippers did not lose themselves. They uncovered parts they had hidden. The god of wine, theatre and transformation had come to remind them that order without passion turns to stone. His cult spread quietly through the world. In some places his rites were peaceful, wine shared in silence, music trembling like breath. In others they were storms of drums and shouts, an invitation to dissolve. The Greeks saw no contradiction. To them, both calm and chaos belonged to him. He was the god who taught mortals that joy and madness are twins, born of the same longing to feel alive. From Dionysus came theatre, the first human attempt to give structure to ecstasy. The chorus replaced the Maenads, the mask replaced possession. The stage became a safe space for danger, a ritual where people could weep and laugh at illusions while secretly recognizing themselves. Every tragedy, every comedy, every whispered line under torchlight was an offering to him, a reminder that storytelling itself was a form of divine madness, tame just enough to be bearable. Later, his worship merged with deeper mysteries, the rites of Eleusis and Orphic rebirth. These ceremonies promised not just pleasure but renewal. In them, wine symbolized blood, and grapes crushed underfoot were proof that life comes from breaking. They whispered of cycles, of descent and return, of the soul's long journey toward understanding. To join these mysteries was to step into darkness willingly. Participants were blindfolded, led underground, and shown small glowing signs, an ear of grain, a flame, a mirror. When they emerged, they said nothing, but their eyes carried a new calm, as though they had glimpsed death and found it patient rather than cruel. Dionysus was always there, somewhere between laughter and silence, showing that ecstasy and peace are not opposites but stages of the same dance. The Greeks both loved and feared him because he represented something no wall or law could contain: surrender. Not defeat, but surrender, the moment the self stops fighting itself. He taught mortals to forget themselves, one poet wrote, and sometimes that's salvation. By the time the Roman poets borrowed his name and called him Bacchus, the god had already become a symbol larger than myth, the eternal pulse of wildness beneath civilization. He was in every festival, every play, every deep breath before song. Even now his shadow lingers wherever joy and danger meet. And perhaps that is his quietest gift. In a world that worships control, he whispers for release. In a world that measures, he reminds. The cup once filled must be emptied. The heart once broken must still beat. He doesn't promise safety. He offers something rarer, the chance to be unguarded, even for a moment, and to find divinity in that risk. The Greeks understood that madness could be holy if it led to clarity, that sometimes losing yourself is the only way to recognize what remains. Dionysus didn't demand faith. He offered perspective, that every life, if lived fully, is a kind of intoxication. If Dionysus had taught mortals to dance with chaos, the next lesson came from those who refused to dance at all. The Greeks called them the Moirai, the Fates, 3 quiet figures who did not shout or fight or drink, but worked instead at a spindle. They wove the threads of all existence, from gods to insects, without hurry and without preference. Clothos spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured it, and Atropos cut it. Even Zeus, for all his thunder and authority, could not change their hands. They were the only power in heaven that needed no temple, because their work never stopped. To the Greeks, this was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant the universe had order, terrifying because that order was indifferent. The Fates did not bargain, they balanced. Every joy had its echo, every tragedy its rhythm. They weren't cruel, only consistent, and somewhere in that consistency people found meaning. When a child was born, it was said the Fates would appear by the cradle, measuring futures in silence. Sometimes poets imagined them whispering, but the sound was so soft that even the gods had to lean close to hear. The Greeks liked that image, destiny not as a proclamation, but as a murmur, easily mistaken for wind. Still, mortals being mortals, they kept trying to ask for spoilers. That is how oracles came to exist, divine customer service for those too impatient to wait for the ending. The most famous was at Delphi, where the priestess sat over a fissure in the earth that breathed warm vapours. She inhaled, drifted into trance, and spoke words that could mean anything or nothing, depending on how you felt about ambiguity. The Greeks, loving riddles almost as much as wine, thought this was perfect. The oracle's temple bore an inscription above its entrance, "Know thyself." It sounded simple enough, until you tried. Kings, generals and wanderers came to ask about wars, marriages, crops, and occasionally, the meaning of happiness. They received answers that were precise in language and useless in practice. Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, once asked if he should attack Persia. The oracle replied, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." Encouraged, Croesus crossed it and lost his own. The Greeks told that story with affectionate irony. They never blamed the oracle, they blamed the question. The gods always answer, they said, just never helpfully. The priestesses of Delphi were called the Pythia, chosen from local women who had lived quiet lives until the god Apollo spoke through them. When she entered trance, her words came out in fragments, sometimes poetry, sometimes babble. The priest nearby would interpret, turning confusion into prophecy. The truth, of course, was that no one knew where the message ended and translation began. Perhaps that was the point. Fate, like language, always changes slightly when spoken aloud. Other sanctuaries echoed Delphi's mystery. In Dodona, priests listened to the rustling of oak leaves. In Ammon's temple in Libya, dreams themselves were divine telegrams. The Greeks believed that if you listened long enough, everything could speak. The wind, the waves, even stones. The problem was never that fate was silent. It was that humans were too loud. Over time, the oracles began to sound like the fates themselves, not deciding, only describing. Their prophecies didn't bind. They revealed the shape of what already was. To ask them a question was to pull gently at the thread of your own story, watching how it trembled through the weave. Some resisted it, others surrendered. The wise learned to ask better questions. Even the gods sometimes consulted Delphi, pretending they didn't already know the answers. Apollo, who presided over the oracle, understood irony. He had once loved a mortal named Cassandra, granting her the gift of prophecy. When she refused his affection, he added a second gift, that no one would believe her. The Greeks found this hilarious in a grim way. It was the perfect description of truth, a voice that can't quite convince the room. Fate to them was not a chain but a grammar, a structure that gave meaning to motion. Every action was a sentence already half written. You could rearrange the words, maybe change the tone, but not the ending. The Moirai were the editors who made sure no story ran too long. It wasn't cruel, just cosmic proofreading. Still, humans dreamed of loopholes. They invented prayers, offerings and arguments with the gods, not because they thought these would change destiny, but because they needed to feel included in its authorship. It was their way of saying, "I was here and I answered back." Some philosophers, more daring than wise, began to argue that perhaps even the fates had limits. Heraclitus said that character is destiny, meaning that what we call fate is simply personality stretched over time. The Stoics later added that acceptance, not resistance, was the key to freedom. We can't control the thread, they said, but we can choose how to hold it. The Greeks liked this idea. It made fatalism sound dignified, yet even they never lost their reverence for mystery. In the quiet moments of the day, when the wind passed through olive trees or the sea sighed against rocks, they believed they could almost hear the loom at work, the soft rhythm of eternity weaving itself one life at a time. Each strand shimmered for a while, then faded, replaced by others, and still the pattern grew. The poet said that when someone died, Atropos' scissors didn't make a sound. They were too sharp for that. The thread simply stopped trembling, and the loom continued, unbothered. But sometimes, if a life had burned brightly, the thread left behind a faint echo, a hum that the living mistook for memory. It was enough. The Greeks didn't fear this. To them, being woven was better than being loose. A pattern, however brief, was proof of belonging. Fate wasn't punishment, it was participation. And the oracles, for all their riddles, had only one consistent message: listen closely, because the answer is already inside the question. In the end, the Moirai never appeared angry or kind, only patient. Their fingers never tired. The thread, whether gold or rough wool, was all the same to them. And perhaps that was the greatest comfort the Greeks ever found, that in a universe ruled by chaos, someone, somewhere, was still quietly stitching it together. For all their fascination with fate, the Greeks never stopped wondering what waited beyond its final knot. Death, to them, was not an ending but a change in address. The underworld was less a punishment and more a geography, a country of quiet boundaries and strict customs, ruled by a god who preferred order to conversation. His name was Hades, and unlike his brothers Zeus and Poseidon, he didn't seek attention. He simply waited. To reach his realm, every soul had to cross the river Styx, whose waters erased all memory of the living world. The dead lined its banks in endless twilight, waiting for the ferryman, Charon. He charged 1 coin for passage, small enough to be affordable, heavy enough to be remembered. The living placed it under the tongue of their dead, a final payment for a journey that could not be postponed. Those who arrived without it wandered the shore, forgotten by both worlds. Charon rowed silently, his oar cutting through black water that reflected no light. He did not judge or speak. His task was simple, to ferry what no longer belonged above. Each stroke of the oar sounded like a heartbeat slowing. The Greeks imagined that sound whenever the night grew too still, that faint rhythmic reminder that time itself was always rowing somewhere else. On the far bank, Cerberus guarded the gate, a dog with 3 heads, each one sniffing for deceit. His eyes were said to gleam like torches, though the poets admitted that most souls were too frightened to check. Once across, no one returned without permission. The underworld was not cruel, it was efficient. Its boundaries were absolute, and within them lay a strange order the living could only guess at. The land of the dead had many regions, each shaped by memory. Most souls drifted into the fields of Asphodel, a vast plain of grey grass where neither joy nor pain survived. It was the home of the ordinary, those who had done neither great harm nor great good. The air there was filled with murmurs, the way wind moves through tall reeds. People wandered, recalling fragments of their lives, a name, a scent, a face, before forgetting again. It wasn't torment, it was stillness. To the right lay Elysium, a paradise of heroes and poets, where sunlight fell without heat and the air smelled of cedar and sea salt. There the blessed lived in endless contentment, an eternity of gentle afternoons. Some traditions said that those in Elysium could choose to return to life after 1,000 years, beginning again as children. It was not heaven as later ages imagined it, but a kind of recycling, the soul's way of exhaling and starting over. Deeper still was Tartarus, where the worst offenders were bound in darkness, titans chained in regret, kings who had mocked the gods, liars who had made cleverness a weapon, all were trapped in endless repetition. Sisyphus pushed his stone uphill only to watch it roll down again. Tantalus reached for fruit that bent away. Ixion spun forever on a wheel of his own arrogance. The Greeks saw these not as divine cruelty, but as metaphors sharpened by repetition, that some punishments are simply our habits continued forever. Hades himself ruled from a throne of obsidian beside Persephone, his queen. She was not always there. For half the year she returned to the world above, bringing spring with her. The rest of the time she reigned below, her presence softening the shadows. Her story was one of the few where death and life reached a compromise. Persephone had once been the daughter of Demeter, goddess of harvest. Hades saw her and desired her, which, in Greek myth, was always a bad start. He opened the earth beneath her feet and carried her down into his realm. Demeter searched the world in grief, neglecting her duties until fields withered and mortals starved. Eventually Zeus intervened. Hermes was sent to fetch the girl back, but she had eaten 6 seeds of a pomegranate, food of the dead, binding her to both worlds. The gods, practical as ever, made an arrangement. She would spend part of the year with her mother and part with her husband. When she rose, the earth blossomed. When she descended, it slept. The seasons, the Greeks said, were simply a mother's longing measured in months. This story was more than explanation. It was comfort, proof that even in loss there could be rhythm and even in death return. Every seed planted in the soil was a small act of faith, a reenactment of Persephone's journey. Each winter was not an end, but an interval. The Greeks lived with that metaphor in their hands. Among the shades in Hades' realm, heroes still spoke in soft voices. Orpheus came once, singing for his lost wife, Eurydice. His music moved even the stone-hearted Furies to tears. Hades allowed her to follow him back on one condition, that he not look behind until they both reached the light. He did, of course, because love rarely obeys logic. She vanished again, and his song grew quieter forever. Even Achilles appeared there, his pride gone, his tones subdued. When Odysseus met him during his wanderings, he praised the hero's glory. Achilles replied, "Better to be a servant among the living than a king among the dead." The Greeks remembered that line the way others remember prayers. It was a reminder that even greatness grows small beneath the weight of silence. And yet, the underworld was not despair. It was reflection, a mirror turned inward. The dead didn't suffer, they remembered. In that memory, the living found perspective. Funerary rites, offerings and stories weren't meant to rescue the dead, but to remind the living that they too were part of the same cycle. That every meal shared, every fire lit was a kind of defiance against forgetting. When night fell, and families poured libations of wine onto the ground for their ancestors, they believed it seeped through the soil to reach those who had gone before. It was their way of keeping conversation alive. The earth, they thought, was porous to love. To the Greeks, death was not the opposite of life. It was its completion, the final breath drawn inward before being released again. The soul, light as dust, simply followed the pull of its own story until it settled where it belonged. The underworld was not a punishment. It was the memory of light, still echoing softly in the dark. And when the poets spoke of it, their voices slowed, as though respectful of the distance. They described the land below not as frightening, but as necessary, the shadow that makes the brightness visible. Every myth, they said, ends in silence. but that silence is only the pause before someone begins telling it again. There comes a point in every story when even the loudest voices begin to fade. The Greeks, who had once filled mountains with thunder and oceans with hymns, eventually learned the sound of silence, not the absence of belief, but the soft settling of it. The gods had ruled for ages, shaping seas, hearts, and tempers. But time, which humbles everything, began to touch even Olympus. It didn't happen with rebellion or war. There was no divine coup, no battle in the sky. The change arrived the way twilight does, slowly, unnoticed, until the stars are already out. People kept lighting fires at the altars, but fewer waited for answers. The gods still existed, they just stopped being invited to dinner. Philosophers began the quiet unmaking. Xenophanes was among the first to say it aloud, that if oxen could paint, they'd draw their gods as oxen, and that perhaps humans had made the divine in their own image. It wasn't blasphemy, only observation. Plato followed, turning myths into metaphors. Elegant riddles meant to teach virtue rather than describe weather. To him, Zeus was no longer a lightning thrower but the shape of perfect order. Apollo was the idea of clarity, Dionysus the wild necessity of emotion. The stories didn't die, they evolved into language, then into thought. On the surface, worship continued. Temples were repaired, sacrifices offered. But something had changed. The prayer sounded different, less pleading, more reflective. The Greeks had begun to admire their gods the way one admires grandparents, fondly, but with the quiet knowledge that the world had moved on. When Rome came, it brought bureaucracy to divinity. The gods were renamed, reassigned, catalogued, and duplicated. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite turned Venus, Ares marched under the title of Mars. Olympus was franchised across an empire. Temples multiplied, but mystery thinned. The Romans loved efficiency. Even their miracles arrived on schedule. Still, the old reverence lingered. Farmers whispered to Demeter before planting. Sailors poured wine into the waves for Poseidon. Actors saluted Dionysus before stepping on stage. The gods had become habits, comforting, cultural, half-remembered. Then came another story, quiet at first, a tale of one god, not many. A carpenter's son who preached in dusty villages about mercy and forgiveness. His followers spoke of a single heaven, a single truth, and a love that needed no thunder to prove itself. The Roman world, weary of marble and myth, began to listen. The transition was neither simple nor peaceful. Temples closed, statues were defaced, the oracles fell silent. At Delphi, the priestess's final recorded words were said to be, "The great god Pan is dead." Scholars later debated what she meant, but the Greeks, poetic as ever, took it literally. The wild god of laughter and panic who had lived between forest and dream had gone quiet. The world was changing shape, and yet the Greeks had already prepared for this. They had always believed that gods could die, or at least sleep. Myths were never static. They grew, aged, and reincarnated like people. When one story ended, another rose from its ashes. The gods did not vanish. They simply changed clothes. Through the long centuries that followed, they found new disguises. Apollo's clarity lived in science, Athena's reason in philosophy, Dionysus's spirit in art. The Muses became inspiration itself, invisible but persistent. Even Hades endured, reshaped as mystery, then psychology. The human mind became the new underworld, full of hidden rivers and restless ghosts. During the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered its reflection in old marble, the gods returned in stone and paint. They stepped down from myth into anatomy studies, frescoes and poetry. Artists sculpted their bodies with awe, as if chiselling memory itself. The gods smiled again, not because they were worshipped, but because they were remembered. Memory, after all, had always been their true temple. Centuries later, when science rose and faith fractured, the gods found smaller homes. They lived in metaphors, constellations, theatre scripts, and children's books. They hid in words like muse, chaos, echo. They became psychology's archetypes and literature's companions. When Carl Jung wrote that every person carries an Olympus within, he was only restating what the Greeks had known all along. The divine never leaves, it only changes address. Even today, their shadows linger quietly in our lives. We speak of Achilles' heel when we mean fragility, of Pandora's box when we mean curiosity gone wrong, of narcissism when we mean too much mirror. Our languages still hum with their names disguised as adjectives, warnings, and jokes. The old myths slipped into everyday speech so effortlessly that people forgot they were prayers once. If you walk through the ruins of a Greek temple today, the silence doesn't feel empty. The air still hums faintly, as though stone remembers being believed in. Columns tilt but do not fall, their shadows marking the hours for gods who no longer need them. The sky above is the same one Zeus once claimed. The sea below still answers to no one. Everything remains, just quieter. The Greeks themselves would have smiled at this. They never demanded eternity from their gods, only meaning. And meaning, once born, never truly dies. It shifts form, drifts into other tongues, finds new listeners. Some say that at night, when the wind moves through olive trees on the old hills of Attica, you can still hear a faint laughter, half divine, half human. Perhaps it's Apollo's echo, perhaps Dionysus's sigh, or maybe just memory itself, the last god, the one who never fades because we keep using his name. In that way, mythology never ended, it simply became us. The Greeks looked up at the stars and saw stories. We look at ourselves and see constellations of thought. Their gods still live in how we dream, in how we fear, in how we hope. They whisper through every metaphor we use to make sense of being alive. And so, when the gods grew quiet, the world didn't fall silent. It just began speaking differently, through art, through reason, through the soft hum of imagination that refuses extinction. The temples may have crumbled, but the stories still stand, carried forward by language, by curiosity, by the small, stubborn human desire to keep asking questions that have no final answer. If you listen carefully, in a museum hall, in a classroom, or even in the stillness between thoughts, you might hear them. The old voices softer now, smiling through the centuries, saying, "We are still here, just wearing new names,